Mornings in Joseon start early. A man stretches while others do martial arts training. A noise is heard inside a carriage. Someone wonders whether to mention they've arrived early. He begins walking around the palace and encounters a mysterious figure inside. He gives a slight smile as he listens to what's happening outside. The palace guards train with dumbbells in front of the gate. One guard asks the crown prince if he's there for his morning exercise, and he confirms, asking to open the gate. It's opened and the prince prepares to enter. Inside, several people train with weightlifting equipment, and two men talk about their results. One says he didn't recognize the other because he lost so much weight, and the other compliments his colleague on his muscle gain, commenting on his broadened shoulders. They then start posing, boasting about their bodybuilding. The prince looks to the side and notices something. A man appears extremely exhausted, saying he's only halfway there, wondering why it took him so long to reach halfway. The prince also observes a man bench pressing with all his strength, pushing himself to the max. He notices another squatting with heavy weights, everyone giving their all. He wears a psychopathic expression, thinking their muscles are being perfected. In his past as a bodybuilding instructor, there was nothing he wanted more than this. Choi Young-jik, a common young man from the Republic of Korea who studied food and nutrition in college just to become a complete fitness coach. He first learned weightlifting in the military, being in a frontline unit with no recreational activities. Naturally, going to the gym became his only solace, and even after returning to college, he didn't give up his workouts. People in his history class wondered what a physical education teacher was doing there. And as the semesters passed, our Korean Ronnie Coleman kept getting bigger. Anyway, thanks to that, he got his Class 1 certificate. It was the occasion that sparked a celebration with his friends. If there was anything different from usual, it was him drinking alcohol, which he normally avoided for the sake of his muscles. In his room, Choi snacks while wondering whether to watch YouTube before bed. One of the recommended videos is the reason why the great King Sejong had a short life. Choi thinks it's because he didn't exercise. Already drunk, Choi reflects on what life would be like for a bodybuilder back then. Because of this idea before bed, we'll see the history of Joseon being rewritten by a bodybuilding enthusiast. He fell asleep drunk, thinking it would be really fun. After his sleep, someone says the crown prince must wake up. Choi opens his eyes in pain, wondering where his phone is. But he notices something different when he hears the rooster's crow. He gets up believing he actually drank too much. But upon noticing his hand, he realizes he's in a different place and wonders why he hasn't woken up properly yet. But now that was his reality. Choi seems confused by the situation and lets out a scream that echoes everywhere. A servant says the crown prince must wake up now, sighing in front of his quarters. Choi wonders why this is happening. He regrets becoming an anchovy. Choi becomes desperate, trying to deny reality. But he ends up opening the door and one of his servants greets him. He looks outside his residence and asks about his name. The servant doesn't understand the question but informs that his personal name is Yu and Suji is his courtesy name. Choi asks if his father's birth name is Yi-do, and the servant confirms. Yi-do, the fourth king of Joseon, also known popularly as King Sejong the Great. If his father is King Sejong and his name is Yi-do, in history, he is known as the Great Prince Suang. Finally, he is outraged to have ended up in the Joseon era. The protagonist thinks everything seems very real and must have really gone back in time. Someone calls for His Majesty, stating that Prince Jinyang is entering. Although it's natural to be nervous when encountering something unknown, the thought of seeing that person made Choi's heart race. The most important person held in high regard by all Korean citizens. He's about to have an audience with the great King Sejong, and as a history student, this is an exciting moment. While His Majesty welcomed him, our hero couldn't stop thinking about how everything about him was good. But reality sets in when His Majesty says the reason he called him is to give an order, and thus we are introduced to an extremely overweight version of the king. He asks where the prince is looking and questions if he's a bit sleepy. When asked what the problem is, the prince apologizes. He says that since the king has carried out numerous benevolent actions in handling state affairs, he has been considering what kind of decree he wants to consider for an inexperienced and careless child like him. The king asserts not to say he's inexperienced and says he values the prince's talents, so he plans to appoint him as a provincial governor. The king asks him to go to the nobles' hall and rewrite the books in uppercase letters, and the prince affirms he will obey the orders. Already in the Hall of Nobles, Choi thinks he finally had the chance to visit this hall, and someone informs that the books rewritten by him will be even more valuable. Our prince asks not to praise him too much, and that his brother's handwriting is much better than his, and the servant says it's kind of him. In his thoughts, Choi believes he not only understands their speech but also the written characters. It seems that the memories of the original body's owner remained. Choi then reads and realizes that the letters in the books are not small, but the king said they cannot be easily seen. About the great King Sejong, after the protagonist's observation, he diagnoses him as severely obese with an BMI greater than 35. Furthermore, his face is excessively swollen, and despite the cold morning air, he was sweating. In conclusion, diabetes or impaired glucose tolerance, this is the pre-diabetes stage. He thinks this situation is clear because later in history, King Sejong will pass away. In the end, Danjong becomes king, so he thinks he won't let that happen. A man approaches, catching the prince's attention, and says it's strange coming from him considering his preference for living in the mountains. This is his older brother. Choi asks what brings him there, and his brother explains that he is there to check the books their father will read in advance. He asks him not to mind him and to continue what he's doing. Choi tells his brother that he read after a long time, so some were difficult to read due to their small letters. And he explains that he received the order to rewrite the books with reasonably large letters. His brother says it seems there's a different intention in his words and asks if he also noticed their father's presbyopia. Choi asserts he was just guessing. His brother says he's usually arrogant about such things but changed in a short period. Choi asks since when his father's symptoms started, and his brother replies it was about a year ago, and that it's different from common presbyopia. No one knows about it yet, so his brother asks to keep it a secret. Choi wonders if he acted naturally, and his brother leaves. He thinks he was nervous during that conversation, and that the back of his neck is now stiff. He then makes some movements and puts his joints in place, thinking how wonderful it is. A man there asks what the prince is doing, and that if his neck hurts, he should massage it instead of moving like that. Choi then realizes the men don't know stretching. At this time, there are doctors who can give massages, but they're not very effective. Due to a lack of knowledge in anatomy, it's natural not to understand the relationship between muscle shapes. He thinks he should explain to them in an easier way and asserts that he strained his neck while horseback riding some time ago. He suffered because his neck was stiff, but when he moved his back, he realized something loosened. And now, asking them to look at him, he asserts that what he's doing is effective. Everyone then starts a stretching session, which ends very well, leaving those two men on cloud 9. The next day, people talked about the stretching techniques taught. Someone comments that their neck, which was as stiff as a rock, now moves again and remarks that they don't need to go to the doctor anymore. The modern stretching methods that Prince Suyang taught quickly spread among the scholars in the nobles' hall, but the great prince's greatest concern remains. In wooden and thatched tents, someone asks if anyone is there, while the protagonist walks with a woman who tells him to come out and greet their guests. The cabin owner notices the arrival of the great prince and asks what matter they have to discuss there. Our protagonist informs that he's there to buy oil and is looking for one with sesame, but not perilla or paulownia oil. The man informs that besides sesame oil, they only have soybean oil, which will cost 3 mals, and Choi affirms he'll give him 5 mals with the low-quality oil they have. His servant thinks earlier he bought various random things and can't understand what the prince plans. Our prince thinks if his memory doesn't fail him, he died of severe dermatitis, and until he finds a way back to his time, he must find a solution for it as soon as possible. The men inform that they've arrived, and the prince praises them for the good work. While he thinks, a woman interrupts, saying it seems he's been visiting the village frequently. Choi says his wife is right about what she comments. However, the idea of having a wife is still not clear to him, and she introduces herself, curious about his strange behaviors. Choi stated he was reading a book in the library and found out that in the ancient Song dynasty, there was a device for bathing. Meanwhile, he thinks he needs to act naturally. The wife questions about it while he asserts he's trying to and doesn't seem like a bad idea. What Choi needs most after coming to the Joseon era is soap. If a modern person doesn't properly wash clothes after exercising, they can suffer several skin consequences. Even in the Joseon era, you can't do weightlifting without soap because how many and how terrible would the skin diseases that could arise be? In his time on Earth, Choi used to work in a gym and already had the experience of making soap. His landlady grandmother made a different soap, saying she didn't trust market soaps. The recipe was surprisingly simple. Just mix water with burnt straw ashes and natural olive oil and add powdered herbs to heat them. With this method, even in the Joseon era, it's possible to make soap. The woman asserts that oil dirties the body, and she would have never imagined that the material for washing the body would be oil. Choi says he's determined to try various things. The book states that boiling water from bush sprouts completely removes stains from clothes, and even tough stains are eliminated. His wife then falls silent and leaves, saying she hopes it really works that way. Choi, in turn, thinks about what's happening and believes the harmony doesn't seem good. On another morning at the location, soap making begins by Choi. He thinks the saponification process is a success for now, and to find the perfect ratio, he has to keep experimenting. However, just by looking, it doesn't look much like soap, and Choi wonders how effective it will be in cleaning. So he decides to try it first and realizes there's still a lot to improve, but the cleaning ability is acceptable. Although the main ingredient is sesame oil, so the smell isn't very pleasant. He thinks that if he solves the smell problem, it'll be possible to produce on a large scale and wonders if he can end up selling abundantly in the Ming dynasty. The next destination now is King Sejong's health. It's said that even King Taejong, known for his strict approach, gave up trying to make King Sejong exercise. For a king who doesn't listen to his own father, a second son who's not even the crown prince trying to make him exercise would make him extremely irritated. Thinking that in the end, to convince the king, he must logically convince him. Choi realizes even his physical form is a problem and can't teach weightlifting with a body like that. To increase persuasion, he must achieve a 400 kilograms lift in the 3 main disciplines and about 670 pounds of muscle mass, making a pose in the middle of the bath that leaves people in the place confused. The next step is to turn weightlifting into an academic discipline and create a book containing that history. Choi thinks of a saying that mentions prestige and good reputation. If they improve the bodies inherited from their parents, this would be filial, so he'll make a book that records the discipline of building oneself and shaping the body, named Bodybuilding Secretary. Later in the palace, the prince began to exercise by doing pull-ups on a piece of wood connected to a door. After finishing his session, he wonders what talented body it is. In addition to pull-ups, he also did dips, push-ups, and even the dragon flag. He thinks that for the other parts, at least there's some talent, but the core strength and pulling are beyond the reach of ordinary people. It's impressive that he can do 15 push-ups in a row without getting tired even with this excess abdominal fat. Then thinking if it's true that his lineage won't go anywhere. The servants inform that the materials the prince ordered have arrived. Choi ordered dumbbells, and the man says it's reassuring to hear that he liked it, especially since it's the first time he's done it. The prince is very happy as the men leave the room. They talk among themselves that Prince Jingyang has finally gone mad because spending 80 acres of rice to buy those cast irons is a horrible decision. He states that even in the samurai family there is no need for so much iron, but he concludes that perhaps the prince is recruiting soldiers, and his colleague asks him to speak quietly and be careful what he says around people because they only need money in circulation. Choi thinks that his calisthenic exercise so far hasn't made much of a difference, but it will be different with this much iron. The wife's servant tells her that even though she is royalty, it's an exaggeration, and asks if her lady will just watch, but is cut off by her. The servant asks why she doesn't try washing her body with oil and criticizes the protagonist's decision to spend 80 acres on a bunch of iron. The prince's wife thought he was obsessed with hunting for a long time, but now he was obsessed with strange objects and doesn't know what she did wrong. She then tells her to stop saying those things, leaving her servant a little embarrassed. She reminisces about good memories with the prince, like the day he handed her a rose, but today it's not the same anymore, and she cuts one of the roses she had received, thinking she wants to sleep early this day and doesn't need attention from others. The woman then starts to take her bath and observes the soap made by the prince. She wonders if she should wash her body with it and decides to try it once, thus passing the soap over all parts of her body and realizing that it was very different from the usual. Choi came out of his bath thinking he really needed to lift weights to feel like he had exercised. Suddenly, he hears a noise and asks who's there. He realizes it's his wife, and she comments that the soap called Dirt Remover is great, but the strong smell of sesame oil is a problem, and if she bathes with it every day, someone might mistake her for an oil vendor's wife. Choi then asks if it would be better to use pig oil or beef oil, but remembers that it is a very expensive product and with a not-so-different smell. Instead of selling to the Ming dynasty, this will become an exclusive business for the nobles of the Joseon dynasty. He says he found an easy solution to solve that and asks what she thinks of mixing camellia oil, affirming enthusiastically that it will surely have a better smell than sesame oil, thanking his wife and leaving her blushing. In the Gakon region, a man greets the great General Jin Yang. Our prince says the man's face is engraved in his memory and asks if he participated in the hunt last winter. Trying to drive the deer out of the thicket, the man's body was very hurt. People went through a lot of difficulties, and now the prince came to compensate even if it's late. Choi says he would give him his silver, but it seemed wrong and states that for his house, every 15 days, 2 bags of rice and eggs will be sent along with chicken meat and more things. Our prince asks him to make sure to use this especially with his family, and the grateful man asks how he could repay for the kindness. Choi, in turn, states that there is no need to repay, just to inform every fortnight the growth and weight of his children. He promised to provide food for 20 families, and with that, he recorded the weight and height of the children, giving a balanced diet focusing on proteins for 10 of them. And for the other half, a diet focusing on carbohydrates and fats is provided. Next, changes in the physical shape and mutual abilities of the children will be recorded to use them as reference data. In his thoughts, Choi gained an advantage over his father when he convinces him to exercise. A blacksmith hammers on a sword while the protagonist asks a man if he can do what's on paper. The man says he can't read but understands numbers, and a round piece of iron weighs 30 kilograms. The stain weight has 3 lids of the Warsaw-style pot. He asks if the protagonist plans to fit them on a pointed pin, which Choi confirms. He asks if this means that 4 will be placed on each side, and is shocked to think that if there are 8, it will be 240 kilograms. The prince says that to be honest, in the end, an even more powerful weight will be needed, and that this bar must support at least 300 kilograms. Our prince then takes a paper from his body and tells the man to wrap the iron plate in a bar about 3 feet long. Our prince thinks that is interesting, and with the technical capabilities of this era, maybe it is possible to make a gun. A man says he believes His Majesty will certainly appreciate the invention as it deserves. Our protagonist thinks that since he took over this body, the prince's image has improved, and in this case, he is there exactly to restore order. Suddenly, the prince's attention turns to the man next to him. By activating the coach's eye, he realizes that the man has a standard body constitution, excellent shoulders and triceps, wide muscles resistant in the back, dense muscles in the shoulders and trapezius. Choi thinks this guy is an illegitimate son, so he can't become an officer. However, he is the ideal candidate for the initial tests. Choi says he wants the man to become his first student on the path to the perfection of the body, and if everything goes well, he will have no rivals in the entire ocean. The man fills with happiness, believing he has gained an advantage, and asks how he can thank his lord. Choi, in turn, says there is no need and just to trust him, thinking that the man doesn't even suspect what he's getting into. In his quarters, the crown prince is summoned by our hero. He wonders if Choi really came, and Choi confirms that he did. The crown prince analyzes our hero's body and says he has noticed many improvements and is curious about where this encounter will lead. Choi says that apparently creating new training methods instead of hunting improves his body, and that he actually came because he would like the prince to take a look at something. The crown prince asks about the new training method and what it would be. Our hero then presents the soap. The crown prince says that it is truly a miraculous substance that removes contaminations. However, the price of camellia oil is very high. But if it were just an expensive oil, it would be a waste of rice. So depending on the manufacturing process, it can become quite economical. The crown prince asks to borrow the brush for a minute and says he understands. Our protagonist suggests that he managed to get rid of dirt with the help of the soap created by Prince Jinyang. And to avoid dirtying the books, all employees should wash their hands with it in the morning and at night. The crown prince says that in his opinion, despite the high cost of the soap, almost everyone will be able to afford to use it. But considering the novelty of the product, people still won't buy it. Our prince then asks if he plans to force all employees to use it. However, it is denied by the crown prince, who says it will be better to present it in a way that hints at the benefits so that they will want to use it on their own. Choi thinks that this will be like a free sample currently. The crown prince says it is easier to distribute widely if private negotiations begin, and then a tax can be introduced on it, which will be a new source of income. Choi thinks the tax is really a good idea and that it's not for nothing after all. He is the first son of the great Sejong and the future King Munjong. In the blacksmith's hut, a man asks if they are sure that the great Prince Jinyang ordered that, and the men affirm that they are. The man asserts that they know what will happen if they make a mistake, and the blacksmith wishes the lord a good trip. One of the blacksmiths asserts that the items ordered by the great General Jinyang must be immediately melted down and destroyed, but the other says that the deadlines are approaching and the damages will be colossal. His colleague, however, questions if for him coins are worth more than life, and if they are, then he should proceed, affirming that they do not know the prince's intention in making these iron bars. The wanderers from before continue through the village, and it is reported that the second prince is unable to deserve the right of succession, but has spent a large amount of resources on buying iron. For days on end, he has been forging his body, so Prince Jinyang must be finally showing his true nature. A man comments if the other saw that. He says that when he washed his hands using a product called soap, the ink stains disappeared and the oil from his face also easily removed, thinking it is truly a miraculous substance. They wonder who came up with that idea, and one of them says it must have been the crown prince. One of them comments that the credits go to Prince Jinyang, and people seem not to believe. Choi trains his body doing a flat bench press. His servant helps with the spotting while his repetitions already reach 9. He then thinks he can do a bench press with 45 kilograms for 10 repetitions. Choi puts away the weight and the servant says he is already very skilled in this exercise. The prince then begins a motivational speech and thinks that even though he remembers rusty dumbbells from a neighborhood gym, the benefits are massive. However, with production, they faced many difficulties. The blacksmith ended up refunding the money because he said there were certain unforeseen circumstances in making the remaining equipment. They not only failed to complete on time, but also missed the design. Choi then says now it's his servant's turn. The servant despairs, affirming that if he takes that weight, he will be crushed to death. However, the prince does not want to debate and affirms that he needs to stimulate his body with a scary face. Choi then gives training tips while the servant struggles. His wife approaches, thinking that before he was skinny, but now his body is radiating strength, and her servant compares him to General Wenbano. The prince is distracted from the exercise and asks if what his wife is saying is true. He heard that he is a true hero from a young age and in maturity, distinguished himself in the role of general, thinking then if he should implement a fee for military training. While his servant almost dies in the bench press, the prince affirms that a weapon alone is not enough for victory. Suddenly, a noise at the gate catches everyone's attention. Choi wonders who dares to enter so brazenly through the gates of his house. It's the wanderers from before. They enter the place with serious faces and go towards the prince. The wife asks what's happening and if they know that property belongs to Prince Jinyang. One of the men in a frightening manner says that they are already aware, and that if she is the man's wife, she should have the courtesy to stay silent. She then prepares to submit, but our hero steps forward, knocking the man down. Fallen on the ground, he asks how he was knocked down so easily, and the prince says not to lay their dirty hands on his wife. The samurai then prepare to draw their swords, but their chief calms them down and introduces himself, saying it's a pleasure to see him again after last year's hunting tournament. Our prince asks what's going on, and if they dare to touch his men, things will get ugly. One of the samurai shouts, asking if he forgot his mistakes, and the chief comments on the object he holds, capable of producing 20 swords, then questioning what he will do with 400 swords. The man helped before is tied up and made hostage. That chief comments that 7 months ago, nobody was interested in him, and out of nowhere started helping the poor, asking if he wants to lead them to a rebellion. The prince affirms they are just assumptions and says that bringing in soldiers based on that is an abuse of power. The man asserts there is no need for proof and that gossip spreads quickly, then asks if he remembers that they always act like this, and in the end everything that is secret becomes evident. Choi asks what will happen if he is wrong, but the chief is certain of his opinions, affirming that he will interrogate everyone around them. Choi thinks about detention and interrogation, and even if he declares his innocence, they won't calm down. This is a typical investigation of enmity. After all, he hasn't done anything wrong since taking over the prince's body and doesn't know what intrigues they had before his appearance. He then takes a deep breath and wonders what he should do now. Suddenly, someone arrives and asks what's going on there. Choi is surprised and realizes it's his brother. The crown prince says he came personally because the bad rumors about him have spread everywhere. He stated that he believed he had found a way to train his body, while the samurais ask him to stay away from this madman. The first prince then questions whether Choi is mad, telling him to be more careful with his words because he is not a madman. Everywhere there are those discontented with someone using wealth for personal purposes, but he will give his brother a chance to explain himself. However, even though they are family, getting rid of these rumors will be difficult, so strong arguments will be needed. Finally, he says that if the accusations are false, there will be no escape. He won't be able to get away so easily. The crown prince affirms that if he accuses his brother and cannot prove it, he won't get away with it. Our prince then pounds his bar on the ground and says he needs help, asking his servant to bring that book. He says he has a valid reason for creating all this, and it's about developing education about a healthy lifestyle. Choi hands the book to the prince and asks him to familiarize himself with the information. The first prince starts reading and sees that the philosophy seems to make sense. However, he still doesn't understand the need for so much investment in it, asking why so much is being spent on the healing method. Choi approaches his brother's ear and says that the older brother knows that their father is growing weaker every day. The brother says that only presbyopia has caught up with him earlier, so there's no need to worry so much, and that if he has any knowledge of medicine, he should clarify. Choi asserts that recently their father has been afflicted by a fever, and despite the cool weather, sweat pours abundantly down his face. Our protagonist states that he doesn't want to jump to conclusions, but he suspects that he has diabetes. He believes that the cause may be an excess of yang energy, and also the fact that His Majesty overeats. Since he does not engage in physical activities, the yang energy cannot be released. Therefore, a significant part of the problem manifests itself through a disease that affects his eyes. The first prince, in turn, questions about assistance to the poor, asking if that is also related to their father. Choi asserts that it was all for his research and says that in his book, all topics related to nutrition and exercises are recorded. He states that he wants to convince their father of what is written. The first prince then shouts that from what he heard, Prince Jingyang is innocent. However, the chief samurai says that it won't work because conducting investigations and trials is his duty. He says that His Majesty will not be pleased with his rights being challenged, asserting that competent inspectors of various ranks have gathered there. The chief then asks if he wants him to simply obey the command or set an example for his soldiers, and that if he wants to expel them from there, he will have to start by expelling him. The man tells the heir that covering up for someone just because of ties is wrong because he will be the future king, telling him to be resolute and show the world the greatness of his country's laws. Lee Suk-chae did not simply reach the position of chief inspector. Now this problem concerns not only the two of them, since he involved the crown prince in all of this. Seeing that there is nothing to be done, the crown prince asks him to explain the reason for buying everything. Since that's the case, Choi says he will personally show it to him, proving it with all his might. In the king's body, yang energy has accumulated, which affected his vision, resulting in presbyopia, but he believes he can overcome diseases by strengthening the body. Everyone knows that Your Majesty spares no physical effort. However, if we demonstrate to him an unprecedented power, he will be interested. If we show strength equivalent to the achievements of Yan Yu, he may abandon his skepticism. Choi then says that if he can't convince them, he won't convince his father. The crown prince again draws everyone's attention, explaining that Prince Jingyang has been developing healing methods for the people, and these adaptations were created for this purpose. The chief asks if he's really using that for training, wondering about a piece of iron that weighs more than a sturdy pot. The prince says he just realized that maybe the purchase of everything was for the inspection. And if he's right, why not allow the young man to demonstrate his abilities to clear his name? One of the samurais then says he will check because in strength he is the best, and if the prince loses, it will be clear that he lied. Choi then stretches and prepares for the competition. The two lie down on the bench press, and Choi explains about the exercise, giving details on how to do it correctly. The soldier asks if it's not just a matter of strength and if the prince is afraid of losing. The man then takes a deep breath, exerting tremendous force, and realizes that it's actually heavier than it seems, but he can't fail, dedicating himself to the maximum to lift that bar. He manages to complete one repetition. The guard who is spotting thinks about what to expect now and looks at the prince, but realizes that he is still in the middle of a movement. The soldier then mocks him, saying he pretended to be strong but is shedding tears. However, everyone's expression changes, realizing something incredible. Choi did his bench press up to the 10th repetition. After finishing his set, His servant says it was amazing, and the soldier thinks it's unbelievable that he lost his strength competition. Choi asserts that in physical fitness training, the number of repetitions depends on the training goal, and says he can lift up to 105 kilograms at once, which impresses everyone. That soldier says it's absurd because even though he won the competition, that's unreal. The chief inspector then says they're leaving for today. But that doesn't mean the prince is out of suspicion. He will then continue to do his job with all his effort. Choi, with a confident look, asserts that he will do the same, and thinks that anyway, he is out of immediate danger now, and the older brother is now aware of the king's illness. The crown prince says he will also withdraw, and Choi wishes him to take care. He remembers that his older brother said he would help him with the elaboration of his book, and that in the end, everything turned out well. Addressing his wife, Choi apologizes, but she expresses embarrassment for not recognizing the good intention earlier. While stating that he won't let something like this happen again, he embraces her. This leaves her extremely embarrassed in front of others at the location. She asserts that they can't do such a thing there and should go to their room, making Choi even more ashamed. One of the inspection members apologizes for what happened and says he will take responsibility. However, the chief explains that it's not like they didn't gain anything. The chief says that among those devices is an unusually thin and hollow item that resembles Chongtong. He then asks if he's improving the Si Chongtong to develop a new firearm, and that a year ago during the hunting contest, he clearly saw the true intentions of that beast. Would that Prince Jinyang be creating the Secretary of Corporal Constitution as a final act of pity? That's ridiculous, so the chief says he'll keep an eye out to find out what he's really hiding. While Prince Jinyang continues his daily life as usual, after a few days, news came that the forge resumed construction of the devices. And then 3 months later, his wife surprises Choi by saying she went to the doctor and that she's pregnant. She said she thinks she got pregnant that day. Choi remembers a conversation with a friend at the bar where he said he didn't have time to work out. Choi then asserts to trust him and that his friend's life would change if he exercised. But the friend says it's nonsense and doesn't want to be bothered by someone who hasn't even married until 40. Our protagonist then says he has 2 wives and remembers his barbell and dumbbell. Just a few days ago, that was his life, but now he would be a father. Choi lifts his wife by the waist, questioning the information with happiness, and he suggests that they inform His Majesty of this news, and his wife says it gives her immense pleasure to see him so happy. She asserts that she has to give birth to a healthy child, so she also wants to learn the Secretary of Corporal Construction. Choi then begins his wife's training with a simple posture, asking her to inhale and exhale. He thinks that stretching is not enough for a safe childbirth, and that after giving birth, the crown princess died from pleural fever. That's how maternal fetal death happens, but he thinks that using it for disinfection can be very helpful. Someone informs them that they have a guest, and a man asks if he calls that sojigori. The old man said he had no idea it was possible to produce distilled liquor in this way. Choi asserts that the design was developed by him and that he wants to obtain pure alcohol, so he made this thin and elongated part. The second prince asks them to bring all the soju inside his house. Later, Choi understands that now that the distillation is ready, he has to check the purity of the alcohol. There are 2 glasses with the same weight, but one of them was filled with water up to 80%. The relative density of alcohol is 0.8, so if the filtered alcohol is heavier or lighter than water, it means he failed. The 2 bodies then begin to adjust on the scale and finally reach the balance point, which leaves them both very happy. The disinfectant production was successful. It's been a long time since our protagonist arrived in the Joseon era. He often thought he would return to the modern era if he exercised, but that was just something in his head. He even wondered what happened in the present where he originally lived, and although many questions remained. After his child was born, he was fully absorbed in his life in Joseon. In the palace, it is commented that Prince Jinyang has recently made a great achievement. The king says he distributed soap among the population, enriching the royal treasury, and invented a disinfectant that helps with wounds, which leaves Choi grateful, but he asserts that he still has much to learn. Sujong asserts that he doesn't need to be so humble, and that he will give him 200 silver ninings as compensation. Recently, Prince Jin had his first child, and the princess returned to her normal life in a week, proving the effectiveness of the disinfectant. The king asserts that from now on, the disinfectant will be used to treat all mothers and newborns. He is proud of his son because he once thought he was just a sore spot, but Jin has shown maturity. As he looks at him, the king's eyes gradually close until he passes out. People despair around the king, clamoring for a doctor to be called. This year is March 1438, and Sejong's illness suddenly worsened. The crown prince says the king's illness worsened, and fortunately, he recovered quickly, but the unease remains. When asked how he is now, he says thirst makes him drink a lot of water, and his vision has deteriorated a lot. Even the decoction had no positive effect. Choi asks his brother if the father has mentioned symptoms, things like seeing a fog and insects around. This is something his grandfather mentioned one day when he suffered from diabetes. His brother says he never mentioned such symptoms, but says it's frustrating not being able to see things from afar. Choi asserts that in this case, it's not so serious yet, and that this symptom may be a consequence of overwork. But he thinks they can't be at ease because with this type of disease, if nothing is done, it will be like in the story, and in a year, the great King Sejong will lose his vision due to complications. Mentioning that his mother's birthday is this September, he asserts that he will create an opportunity to change his father's mind on that day. His brother asks what the hell he's planning to do at a royal banquet, and Choi explains that in the corporal construction secretary there are 3 exercises that use heavy weights. Squat, bench press, and deadlift are called the big 3 exercises. At his mother's birthday banquet, he will perform a total of 375 kilograms in the 3 exercises. The crown prince asks if that isn't ridiculous, because the palace guards who were ordered to try couldn't even lift 225 kilograms. Choi asserts that at the moment he can't lift that weight yet, but he will surely succeed for the sake of his father. The brother says that if that's his will, he will do everything to help, and Choi asserts that he wants to create a book that his father will be pleased with. His brother, however, says that he should also dedicate himself to studies, which makes Choi confused. The brother says that since he wrote a book, he should incorporate the content of all 13 classics. Choi tries to maintain composure but thinks he's screwed to do that, but that's to save the great King Sejong. So finally, Choi says that his brother can count on him, and that when he reaches 375 kilograms in the big 3, they will bring up the topic of the book in front of their father and ensure he tries their method. They then argue for their father's well-being. Choi thinks he's about to take on something really crazy because increasing by a few percent in 6 months is already questionable. But even if he succeeds, this body loaded with fat won't be a convincing argument. He believes that to showcase his muscles in all their glory, he needs to lose about 3 kilograms of fat. And the best way to burn calories in this era is walking. He hopes the unlimited potential of this body will be useful. Back at home, he reads the books his brother requested while pondering his exhausting routine. While contemplating giving up, he imagines what his brother would say to him. Choi understands he can't complain at this moment. With his meal on the table, his wife asks if it's acceptable for him. She explains that oatmeal is something eaten to fill the stomach, and Choi asserts that he must prove himself at his mother's birthday. While talking about his extra fat, he asserts that he will eat until his filial piety is proven. His wife says she can't understand her husband's ambition, and fearing the porridge might be bland without seasoning, she salted it. Respecting her husband's decision, she asks if their servant is there and requests to take away the served table and bring a new one, asserting to make sure to never add seasoning to her beloved's food while he cries. After another running session in the forest, more deadlift training, climbing, and readings, Choi atop a mountain thinks time flew by quickly. The day of Queen Sojin's birthday banquet arrives. A man makes a presentation by standing on a horse. Sojin is delighted, saying that Myogu's riding talent has reached a new level. The king also appeared happy, but he was actually very sad about the state of his vision. The crown prince says it's our protagonist's turn, and everyone thinks he will perform like street performers. Choi asks if he mentioned the book, and the crown prince says that when he told the princess that he lifts 112 kilograms, she didn't believe it. So he asks Choi to proceed with the plan, because his father will surely show interest in the book. The prince then says seriously that this is something he really wants from his brother. During Queen Sojin's birthday party, Prince Jinyang's turn to present arrived. He squats and congratulates his mother on her birthday, because the fact that he exists in that world is all thanks to the divine kindness of the king and Her Majesty the Queen. With that in mind, he created the Corporal Construction Secretary, which means healthy discipline for self-enlightenment and the development of a fit body. The king asks Yu what that huge iron object behind him is and what he's trying to show. Choi says he prepared something small just to repay his kindness, and as he holds the bar, he says he's overwhelmed with countless emotions. He removes his cloak, showing his exceptional body to everyone, saying that what they are seeing today is something granted by both of his parents. At Queen Sojin's birthday in the year 1438, the ceremony that changed the course of history unfolds now. The soldiers are stunned, saying they've never seen a body like this in their lives and wondering if this is the prince they know. Choi then says he will start, and everyone wonders what he will do. He lies down on the bench press with the weights and begins repetitions. Once again, he surprises others and continues his repetitions one after another. The soldiers don't understand where he got all that strength. Then the bench press set ends successfully. Choi says that one of the important activities in his book is this exercise called bench press. Through it, one can train the chest, shoulders, and arms. The queen applauds but says she doesn't understand what she just saw and asks how much it all weighs. Choi asserts that the bar weighs 24 kilograms and the cylindrical plates combined weigh about 144 kilograms. In total, the weight is 168 kilograms, which impresses the king and the queen. Choi then presents his next exercise, the squat. The exercise involves lifting a large bar on the shoulders and using the power of the legs to sit and stand repeatedly. This technique not only trains the legs but also the glutes, waist, and lower abdomen. The queen despairs, telling her son to stop it immediately. However, the second prince ignores her and says he will now do the squats. He takes the bar off the rack and rests it on his trapezius with the low bar technique. Choi then squats like he never squatted before. He focuses on the eccentric phase and gathers all his strength to do the concentric, and he finishes his movement with 204 kilograms. The queen is surprised that her son managed to stand up, and the king asks his servant to call a doctor, asking if it's even possible for the human body, but his servant also doesn't know. But this spectacle seems to be related to the so-called healthy discipline. Choi then presents the last activity called deadlift, and for that, the largest iron bar is used. Everyone goes crazy with what was said, and the crown prince decides to intervene in his father's conversation. He says he's worried that Yu's waist might be injured. With the king's permission, he says he will take some precautionary measures, thus putting a belt around his brother's core. For a brief moment, the two look at each other fearfully, because now the weight is 240 kilograms. Choi tells his father and mother that since they granted him a body capable of using such power, he will continue to care for it properly and fulfill his duties. The inspection members comment among themselves that the prince must have lost his mind and gone crazy. Choi asserts that he could have handled more weight than that, but from his current body, this weight is overwhelming. Although the belt around the waist helps a little, this plan is still completely absurd. To reach 375 kilograms in the big 3 exercises in just 2 years. Finally, he thinks that it can't be avoided, and he has no choice but to use the sumo deadlift style. He then prepares himself, taking a deep breath and gripping his hands against the bar, thus beginning the weightlifting work. Everyone realizes that the bar is going up and wonders if it's really possible for this mass of iron to be lifted by just one person. As the weight goes up, his hands begin to bleed. But Choi doesn't give up and finishes his movement perfectly. The queen's pressure lowered while the king remained impressed. The prince lets the bar fall, causing the ground to break, resulting in an incredible spectacle for everyone. People are amazed at what they have just witnessed, and the queen prepares to take action. She gets up with a serious face, and the king doesn't understand why. Addressing her son, she goes to check his hand that got cut during the movement. She says he's been using these irons daily for 2 years, and now his hands are like this, asking what he means by this filial piety talk. Seeing him train his body to this extreme makes her tears flow incessantly. The women present sympathize with the queen's feelings and start crying too. A man says he knows that those who master martial arts can show visible muscles in the abdomen, but having such a distinct texture is incredible. The king asserts that indeed he personally tested the regimen from his book and showed hard work, but he says he has one thing to ask, questioning the purpose of the healthy discipline he showed on this occasion. Choi asserts that it's to establish and perfectly prepare the body they both granted him. The king asks if lifting that weight today would be the standard, as in that case he would fear his instructions might haunt the weaker ones. Choi explains that it's nothing like that because he started this discipline to get rid of the fat in his abdomen, and his strength naturally increased in the process. And that in just 3 months, his limbs move smoothly and his fatigue has disappeared. Sejong says he knows that he and the crown prince authored books about this and asserts that he will read and distinguish right from wrong, commenting that afterward, they will discuss the corporal construction secretary at the palace, which makes Choi extremely happy. Furthermore, the king asserts that the royal title of Grand Prince Jinyang no longer seems satisfactory. Because he invented a discipline and took it to its peak, he suggests adding Su from Soyangbu to his name. His name will now be Grand Prince Suang. In his chambers, the king realizes that the book is truly extraordinary, and questions because even if Jinyang was helped until then, he wasn't that wise. The crown prince said that he also read the book and was amazed. He simply compiled the regimen that you created in those books. Unlike other books, there's a diagram he specifically placed at the end of volume 1. The king then says he will check. He reads about changes in dietary habits and children's bodies that the prince recorded. It says that if you cook rice with 6 kilograms of grains, an adult can eat for 10 days while children can fill their stomachs twice as much. On the other hand, excess food results in excessive fat, and a spoon of sesame oil every day overflows children's bodies with strength. Meanwhile, a person with a full stomach gains more than 300 grams of excess fat in a month. After reading that, the king thinks about excessive fat and looks at his belly. On the other side of the palace, Choi asks his older brother about their father's response, and the crown prince replies that he decided to give the corporal construction secretary a chance. Choi asserts that he's already fully prepared, and that since it's the first day, he will only explain the posture, but the crown prince cuts his excitement, stating that with national affairs overflowing, it was suggested to wait for an auspicious day before continuing with the discussions. Choi asks what day that is because if it takes too long, his vision will deteriorate to blindness. He then quotes a saying that says the hardest part of a healthy lifestyle is starting, and if the great king doesn't come to him, he will have no choice but to visit him himself. Choi then runs out, and the crown prince tells him to wait for him. The guards assert that there are rules in the palace and tell him to get up. However, the prince is adamant and tells them to throw him out with all their physical strength if they can, then being taken away by 3 of the guards. Suddenly, the king appears, asking what's happening there. He finds the second prince kneeling with his book. Sejong says they are causing disturbances in the royal palace in broad daylight and asks if they forgot their dignity. Choi then addresses his father and says there's something that needs to be discussed. The The king says if it's about the corporal construction secretary, he already read and warned that he would try it when he had time. But his son asserts that the correct approach to the corporal construction secretary is to start as soon as possible and do it consistently. The two then stare at each other with this duality of thoughts. Sejong asked if the second prince wrote the book suspecting he had a disease, and Choi asserts that he interfered because the signs are showing, and the book says the most appropriate thing is to treat the disease early. The king then asks his doctor what signs of illness he has, and he informs that he only sweats deeply and drinks a lot of water. Choi thinks it's obvious why the king brought his doctor, and Sejong uses him to say he has no signs. Our prince thought he must have read the diagram of the book and been seriously contemplating his illness. The issue is that he just hated to exercise. So all that needs to be done is to give him a push. Choi then says that considering the symptoms, he believes it might be type 2 diabetes. He asserted that he tried to put his body in a similar condition, making everyone surprised. However, he never actually put himself in such a situation. Diabetes is a disease where excess yang kai destroys the body, and as we know, sugar is also used as medicine to replenish yang kai. So consuming a lot of grain syrup or caramel can cause temporary diabetes, and as a result of experiencing this, he often became extremely thirsty and drank a bucket of water. Furthermore, his vision often darkened due to excessive fatigue, and he fell asleep on the spot. Hearing all this information, the king identifies. In turn, Choi asks if these symptoms are the same as his father experienced. But in reality, he was lying when he said he had already put himself in that situation. He just resurrected knowledge from the modern world. Furthermore, to convince the great king, he must be able to lie, but unknowingly, he ended up deceiving even his brother. The king asks how long it will take for him to cure his illness if he masters the corporal construction secretary, and the prince asserts that it will take 5 days. Facing this, the king accepts and says if he doesn't improve in 5 days, he will accuse him of crime for deceiving the king. In the training field, the second prince asserts that his father needs to mount the horse a little faster. The king thinks his whole insides will be twisted, and the second prince says he shouldn't lower his body. Sejong thinks his son is being too strict with him and wonders how long he'll have to continue this. Choi warned that since an hour had passed, they could end, and his father was happy. However, he was just talking about warming up. While doing squats, Choi tells his father that he should exhale when exerting his force and inhale when relaxing. He says that doing 24 repetitions is enough and that he should firmly support his back against the bench, also observing the width of his legs and leaning his body forward. A servant of your majesty says it's time for the royal meal, and the king asks him to bring it to him. However, it's just a small and tasteless meal, which leaves the king extremely unhappy. While eating, he thinks this rice texture is horrible, and that eating horse feed is better than this. He then bangs his spoon against the table and demands the royal chef be brought immediately. The servant said he would call, and the king becomes increasingly irritated, saying to take that away from his table and calling the food disgusting. He asks where the meat in the soup went and why there's only tofu and radish slices. The only piece of meat has no fat, and he can't even eat it. While asking to throw it to the horses, Choi enters the hall with a frightening look, asking if the food doesn't suit his father's taste. He said he prepared this meal especially for him. Because to control sugar levels, both grain syrup and honey were removed, and germinated brown rice keeps the feeling of satiety for a long time. Plus, tofu is a useful substitute for meat. Sejong, enraged, says that it's not delicious at all. Choi then apologizes to his father for what he's about to say, but asks if he didn't already absolutely agree to follow his words for the next 6 months. He said he learned in the Analects that a wise man regards promises as high as his life, and he says he's willing to do the unimaginable for such a promise, asking if the king can't fulfill even such a simple one. Sejong starts eating silently and wonders who he took after to be so stubborn. Already in his room, he writes on a scroll with his brush while his hand trembles. He tells a servant that he moved the brush incorrectly, so he should ask the factory to send a new one. Sejong thinks that since he started lifting weights, he doesn't even have the strength to hold the brush. He asserts that it's been 2 weeks since he started doing this, but still doesn't know the meaning. His belly then starts rumbling, and he asks someone to bring him something. But Choi's eye peers through the door, making the king almost jump out of his skin. He apologized to your majesty and said he suspected something was wrong when he stopped mid-sentence. Sejong then says he can go and thinks that this wretch may even appear in his dreams. The candle goes out and the king prepares to sleep. He thought he couldn't fulfill his duties because of that brat, and that if he hadn't promised, he would have stopped long ago. Night falls and the servants guarding the king's door are surprised. They think it's serious because the king usually tells the servants to leave because he snores, and just 2 weeks ago, he couldn't even breathe properly, tossing and turning all the time. But now the king is sleeping soundly, and in his dreams, he imagines himself training him with a beautiful body, which makes him very happy. Finally, the 1-month result of the corporal construction secretary has arrived. Choi asks who's there and realizes there's someone sleeping. The man wonders what's going on and starts hallucinating about the king's second son. He talks to his doll and comments on the deadline for the production of the armillary sphere. The man then, with a strange smile, asks the doll if his majesty will expel him when the high-torque water clock is ready, saying he knew. He asks if he wasn't the king's object, and wonders where his life went wrong while laughing. Amidst his hallucinations, Choi interrupts him, making him realize there's someone else in the room. He apologizes for showing an unfavorable side of himself and asks why he's there. The second commander and Deputy Jang is a genius who went from being a slave to being promoted very quickly to the position of a third-ranking official. As a royal engineer who has significantly contributed to the development of Joseon. Even in modern times, he is often mentioned as an excellent scientist. But somehow his image seemed different from what Choi imagined. While thinking if scientists were really like that, Choi says he would like him to do something for him, and hands him a royal order from His Majesty the King. Upon hearing the words royal order, the scientist enters into total despair. Choi asks him to calm down because he hasn't even reached the main point yet. He asks if the scientist knows about the regiment of the Corporal Construction Secretary, and Jang affirms that he saw him perform it firsthand, remembering that it was truly amazing. Choi says this will expedite the conversation because His Majesty is learning the technique, but the problem is that the gays are getting colder and can't go out. He then would like to request that he create something that can make him feel like he's running in a field even while inside a room. Jang says that this device is something he has never made in his entire life, so he will need time to understand. And since he has a mountain of backlog work, it may be that he can only do it after a few years, which makes Choi think that making a treadmill may be difficult. He then says he will have to find a better way because His Majesty is suffering greatly from his techniques. And thinking about the pain the king is already going through, it may be too early for him to use the step device. Jang asks if the regimen proposed by the prince isn't intended to make the body healthy, and Choi affirms that the weights increase according to the level. There have been many times when he felt pain in his arms, legs, and stomach, and even now that time makes him tremble. Thinking that the prince's method is distressing, he says he would like to refuse if it were up to him. But it seems he has no choice but to do it quickly because it's a royal order. He then says he will draft it immediately and asks him to accompany him. But the prince in turn asks if it won't take years. Jang explains that if they make it with wood like in the picture, it will break quickly, but if they make it with a steel plate, it will be much heavier. So the engineer draws something similar to a hamster wheel, and Choi thinks it makes sense. The prince asks if it will take a month, but Jang affirms that if there are no extravagant decorations, 10 days will be enough. Choi is impressed with the time, asking about the work he has, but Jang affirms that since it's a royal order, he has to work hard. This wasn't his real intention, but for the prince, everything was fine. 10 days later, Choi presents the step device to the crown prince. He says it's a relief to be able to exercise within the palace, but he's worried because the father is the first to use it. Choi then says not to worry because he has already tested it and there are no problems with its operation. His brother says it would be good if everyone were like him, but their father is still a beginner, and you would feel more at ease if someone who doesn't train tested it first. The second prince then smiles and says he has the perfect person for that. The protagonist's brother asks if he's talking about him and that he shouldn't joke like that. He says he doesn't know about the others, but he resembles the father in hating exercises. However, the speeches didn't work and the first prince was put on the wheel to run. Our hero tells him to keep running because only a quarter of an hour has passed. Later, the first prince asks why he also has to do bench presses. And the second one says that someone with a good appearance like his not preparing his body is a shame, so he should do more repetitions. Thinking his brother wants to torture him, the first prince complains while doing his exercise. But Choi asks for more repetitions even though his brother complains a lot. Later, the first prince asks him to be honest because he did 12 squat repetitions before, then asks if his brother is trying to deceive him by increasing the number. Choi affirms that his calculation method changes depending on how the muscles look and asks him to maintain the correct position. He informs that his brother's knees buckled again, and that his back is too inclined forward. The first prince cries, asking for his kind brother to come back. But Choi affirms that he may be a wicked spirit for the sake of his brother's body, and will consider that he will behave and prepare his body now. Amid dumbbells, a scream echoes through the palace. The king runs on the wooden wheel, and the second prince affirms that there are only 15 minutes left. The great king was breathless after running for just 15 minutes at first, but now even an hour is easy. His brother also, who at first could only do 12 repetitions in bench presses, showing that this family's talent is unquestionably another level. The interim second commander also had a considerable role. It's already excellent that he made the step device with the technology of this era, but he requested a field study to find areas for improvement. Choi wondered why his image was different compared to history. But as expected of the greatest scientist of Joseon, he has an extraordinary sense of responsibility. People comment that the king has lost a lot of weight recently and are worried if he got sick or something. One of the men says that Sejong got so tired of exercising with the great Prince Suin that he put political affairs on the back burner. It's in His Majesty's nature to learn any new subject of study, and the great prince is making good use of this trait. The servant told the first prince that everyone was talking about it and didn't tell His Highness to not make him worried. The first prince tells him not to say such things because he also lost extra fat since he started exercising and his father is going through the same. The doctor then asks if rapid fat loss isn't also a symptom of diabetes. and they all start discussing that they can't believe in this situation where the regimen for a healthy body actually harms health. They say they should file a petition asking His Majesty to stop at least for a day. The king then appears asking why they are making such a fuss, and everyone is surprised by the king's new appearance. He then asked again but demonstrates a completely different aura with a much healthier, imposing body. Choi warns that the doctor doesn't need to worry because according to the records of the royal clinic, he's sweating much more and the amount of water consumed has decreased. The doctor asks what will happen if it's really a symptom, and Choi warns that they are only halfway through the promised 6 months. He then asks his brother to wait and see because muscles don't lie. With calluses on his hands, the second prince thinks that time is passing too fast and his life in the 21st century seems just like a dream now. Suddenly, a person approaches talking to the great prince. It was the chief of inspection who incriminated him. He says that the prince entered the office again before sunrise this morning, and Choi asks what an inspector general is doing there so early. The chief says that His Majesty complains of fatigue and has less time to engage in political affairs, so he came there to relieve the burden of the king. Choi smiles, saying that he's working hard and that both want to protect the king's health, and asks if the inspector has any plan to behave and prepare the body. In turn, the inspection chief says that unfortunately, he has a lot of work to do, and as an official, he can't only think about his safety. Choi says he's not as well versed as the inspector when it comes to public sector matters, but if he spends 2 hours exercising, he can dedicate even more in his remaining 22 hours. However, the chief says it may be the opposite, with 22 hours of service being ruined by those 2 hours. Finally, he says he only wishes the best for His Majesty's health. While walking through the snow, he informs that the 6 months he promised will be ending soon. The Inspection General is an organization that investigates the misconduct of all high-ranking officials and reports them. Impeachment based on official rumors can only be impeached based on rumors. Not requiring evidence for a claim, it's okay not to provide any basis for their allegations. They followed only the principles and were objects of fear for the officials. One of the inspectors says that tomorrow is finally the day of military training, and that the chief must make a decision now. All the members of the inspection went to the king and knelt down asking him to reconsider. The king, in turn, asked what brought them there in such a hurry. The chief asks him to stop the bodybuilding secretary's regimen. All disciplines can take time to master. However, the gravity of the matter is different because political duties are more important than anything else. Even though he has never neglected his political duties due to exercises, the inspection chief says the king must set an example. They claim to be concerned that he is just learning a strange discipline and going against established principles. With a serious look, the king says the inspector's problem is affirming only his principles, and sometimes he wonders if this is loyalty or a challenge. The atmosphere becomes tense, and the king asks about the principles mentioned, informing that the reason he learns the bodybuilding secretary is to improve his body and set an example in military training. Among the soldiers, one asserts that it is very dangerous because military training is a law created by the great King Taizhou. Another says that if he is not good at riding horses, he may be in danger, followed by another who asserts that even young people take a year to shoot an arrow on a moving horse. But Sejong remains determined, saying only that one of the royal guards should stay by his side to prevent accidents. The inspector general prepares to give another opinion. However, he is interrupted by the king, who says that if he sets an example in military training, the effectiveness of bodybuilding training will be proven, and then at that moment, he hopes everyone will do at least half of what he did. After understanding the king's threatening message, the scene shifts to Chirwon County in Gangwon Province on a fateful day of military training. The king then shouts that he will personally inspect the front line before conducting the military training. Following his orders, all the soldiers are forced to move according to Adjustment A. Thus, everyone must move in perfect sync, which the soldiers quickly shout that they understand. However, one of them asks if His Majesty has ever moved so swiftly, and another comments that even after a decade of training, he has never seen him do so. That's because even during the last military training, the king was still someone who only gave orders from his carriage, which others carried. In any case, the signal is given to start the military training, along with the order to beat the drums and march forward. Soon, while riding his horse, the king thinks it was worth riding for 2 hours daily alongside his second son. Finally, Sejong understands why Taizhou once told him to enjoy horseback riding, as with a well-maintained body, the task becomes much more rewarding. Given the current situation, the crown prince comments that he never imagined his father would ride a horse so intensely. And at that moment, the king suddenly spots a wild boar among the bushes and thinks he can see further than usual. In this case, he asks his son to hand him his bow and arrow, which is done without delay. Elsewhere in the test, one of the soldiers asks if the inspector general isn't participating in the hunt with His Majesty. Then the inspector simply states that the boy can go ahead, saying he's in no rush. However, this was because he was brooding over the hero in his mind. He thinks he has never forgotten the prince's malicious nature and has known since then that he is the seed of the problem that will harm His Majesty. In light of this, the inspector thinks that essentially military training is something meant to prepare for war, and in war, anything can happen. Then the warrior looks at the protagonist, reiterating the statement about anything being possible with a certain malice. However, just as the soldier was about to do something foolish, a shout is heard announcing that His Majesty has managed to catch a wild boar. With that, all his subordinates begin to congratulate the king on his incredible feat. One of them even comments that it's as if they're witnessing the military training of the great King Tajo. Anyway, Sejong begins to dismount his horse with the help of an aide. As he touches the ground, he apparently slips, leaving his son extremely worried about his condition. However, after being questioned about his health, the king just bursts into laughter, leaving the first prince quite confused. Completely fine, the king states that he has never been able to hit a target with a bow, but now, even in his old age, he is starting to understand what hunting and horseback riding are. The aide, in turn, asks His Majesty to be more careful with his body to avoid risks like the one just now, and in a lighthearted mood, Sejong agrees. With that, the Inspector General observed everything from afar, and since everything seemed to be going well, he could no longer dare to attack the one responsible for it. So setting aside his pride, the warrior put away his arrow and withdrew from the hero's vicinity. This hero now has his moment of glory as he demonstrates through the king's body the validity of his method while helping him to stand up. Sejong, for his part, comments that he has proven for himself that the bodybuilding secretary's technique is not just a simple regimen. Contrary to the inspector's expectations, as everything that initially seemed impossible has been accomplished, it's now finally time for the warriors to fulfill their promises. With that, it is ordered that, in addition to trying it out, everyone must become specialists in the technique proposed by his second son. And since they are merely subordinates, all the soldiers accept the orders without any issues. Later, in the palace quarters, an official announces that the first device, the requested equipment, is ready. Thus, extremely exhausted, the official presents what is called a lat pull-down, commonly known as a back puller that works the lats. Given this, Troy becomes extremely excited, and knowing that a device like this must have been very difficult to make, he decides to test it. With that, the boy sits on the equipment's bench and grabbing the bar in a wide pronated grip, he begins to do his work set. As the muscles warm up, the pump moves to the back region, expanding all the muscles. And after finishing the set, the hero feels a nostalgic feeling and is asked by the staff member about the quality of the equipment. In this case, since it's back training day, the protagonist states that he will keep the equipment and explains that he really liked it. The inventor, in turn, comments that he has also learned many things from the prince, such as the method of using a movable pulley to help balance the weights. This surprises our hero, as the great inventor Jang is learning something from him. However, upon reflection, the technology of movable pulleys was not yet widely used at this time. Regarding his invention, Jang explains that he tried using the device, but it felt like his armpits were going to be torn off. He then considers that His Majesty will suffer greatly. However, he states that since it is a royal order, he has no choice but to fulfill it. But quickly, with a psychotic expression, his true intentions come to light, making the protagonist question whether his decision to help was only because it was an order. In any case, it is mentioned that the next device to be made will be a leg curl. The inventor then explains that the leg curl machine is very difficult to make, which will end up taking a month to develop. Faced with this, Troy begins to believe that the inventor is having many problems and states that he will tell His Majesty to let him have a vacation. However, unexpectedly, Jang refuses even before the sentence is fully completed. This is because he says he is greatly indebted to His Majesty's kindness in allowing him to hold a governmental position despite being a mere slave. In this case, he questioned how he would dare to enjoy luxury and said that just seeing His Highness exercising and regaining health is already gratifying enough. Moreover, it is said that the leg curl resembles a chair that is usually used to play drums. With this, returning to his psychopathic smile, the inventor says he is eager to see how His Majesty will take advantage of this device. Later in the palace, it's questioned how long the great prince will make the king exercise, as it is said that he has been exercising for an hour every day. Then Sejong states that if the soldiers do not follow this path, they will be breaking the promise of something unthinkable between master and subordinate. In this case, the soldiers continue to run even though they are extremely tired, as it is an order from their superior. In such a situation, the warriors ask the prince, who is observing, for help, pleading with him to stop the king's run. However, the hero merely asks with a smile if he has the power to command someone so powerful. Thus, one of the warriors understands that there is no doubt the prince is getting revenge on the Inspector General's office due to previous intrigues. However, while saying this, he trips over a dumbbell and falls face first to the ground, and the soldiers nearby ask if the man is okay. And while sobbing on the ground, the warrior states that at least the soldiers should have continued the run, leaving him behind. But the group's sense of unity is stronger, and so the men state that they will stick together even if they have to carry him on their backs. In light of this, the hero thinks that he can only hear some groans as if they are on the verge of collapsing at any moment. And with that, he smiles with happiness, believing it to be very pleasing to see this in his city. A week after the military training at the house of Inspector General Yi Suk-chi, a warrior asks if his superior really needs to go. And Mag questions what the point is of asking such a question now. Then the boy explains that intruders who don't even know what's happening are talking about dismissal and exile without any commitment to the truth. In any case, the superior states that he will soon be turning 50, which means it's difficult for him to accept anything new now. Undeniably, the inspector admits that His Majesty is indeed becoming healthier due to the technique described in the bodybuilding secretary. However, not only him, but also the great prince Jin Suing, who has become a completely different person from what he was before. Furthermore, he says that even though it is not part of the main government affairs, the recent movements of the Jurchen people are unusual. With this, he plans to go to the Hambo province as the provincial governor to keep an eye on them. Finally, he asks his subordinate to tell the great prince Suing to be careful with the visit from the Ministry of Rights of the Ming Empire. It was heard that during the last visit, the eunuch Changxing tried the soap and bought about 100 of them. Given the situation, it's certain that these soaps ended up in the hands of Wang Zhen, which is bad since rumors say that this same man is raising a hungry ghost inside his body. And evidently, one day this man will approach the great prince Suing to do business. From a different perspective, back in the present, an article about the great prince Suing and his possible connection to time travel was being discussed. During the last Mid-Autumn Harvest Festival, the entire family gathered to enjoy the traditional folk game of weightlifting. And the grandfather of this family was very happy with his grandson's progress. With this, it was a fact that the bodybuilding secretary had taken root in the country. However, all this began with the great Prince Suing, who was the second son of King Sejong the Great. It is also said that folk games were not the only thing he did, for he was also the first creator of soap and surgical alcohol, which led some to claim that he was a time traveler. The expert and director of the Joseon History Archives, Lee Dawen, states that the great prince's technique bears many similarities to modern bodybuilding. She explains that during his youth, the boy was competent to the point of resembling a time traveler, but one day he became negligent in his duties. It is said that if he had spread the bodybuilding secretary further, it wouldn't have been just a traditional folk game. Instead, the technique would have spread worldwide, replacing bodybuilding. In short, the boy is just a meaningless figure who added a simple folk game to the country's cultural heritage. While all this was happening in the present, the hero wakes up from his sleep to continue his modifications for the future. His brother, while working, asks what kind of dream the boy had to behave so prudently. Continuing, he states that the protagonist looks pale, making it necessary to reduce his book reading for a while. Unexpectedly, Cho remembered the events in his dream, so to avoid being criticized by future generations, he decided to dedicate himself even more, even though at the moment he is about to faint from exhaustion under a dense pile of books. In his mind, he remembers that the king said he would create a new set of characters for the people the very next day. He couldn't say that the hero was excellent in studies, but with a passion for leading and preparing the body, he commented that there was nothing they couldn't do. With that, the king asked for help in formulating the Sanskrits, saying that the protagonist could base them on books in the library about phonetics. Thus, Choi began to think about this proposal to create suitable sounds for the instruction of the people as something extremely complicated. Faced with this, the boy remembers that at the moment, his son thinks of his father as just a strange man who visited him in the middle of the night. And in response to this frustration, the crown prince compares the hero's habit of sighing to that of Assistant Commander Jang. After thinking for a bit, the prince asks when his brother thinks about looking for disciples, as he was advised to need the roles of trainer and assistant. In this case, Choi comments that Milion might be a suitable candidate since he is the son of a concubine and cannot rise to a governmental position. With that, it is said that it would be great if it were the boy, but even better if there were people with various identities. Faced with this, Choi asks why they need people with various identities, to which the prince states that they need someone of high status. For to carry out the bodybuilding secretary in the Eastern Palace, they must have a disciple who is a member of the royal family. With that, the hero begins to think about it and realizes that only one person could occupy this position, but he still doesn't know if he would like to teach him. This is because the boy doesn't know if this man will enjoy performing the bodybuilding secretary's technique. The target for being a disciple at the moment is Prince Seosin, the third son of the deposed heir to the throne, Yamyeon. Yamyeon was the crown prince during the reign of King Taejo, but he committed several acts of corruption and infidelity while taking advantage of the royal family. In the end, he was deposed and the great King Sejong ascended to the throne. Furthermore, many people commented that this man's son grew up committing acts of vagabondage. However, later on, when they decided to see him for themselves, the boy acted normally and kindly. In this case, the hero thought that Susan was much more normal than he had imagined. In his mind, the protagonist knows that the reason the prince went mad was because his father insulted his concubine, but apparently that hasn't happened yet. Anyway, Choi asks if the boy has heard of the bodybuilding secretary, to which the boy affirms that he knows of it, as it is already a well-recognized discipline. With that, the hero asks if the boy wants to be his disciple to transfer the knowledge of body preparation, and Susan accepts very politely. Apparently, everything was going well, so Choi called his subordinate May, and he was instructed to have the nobles start warming up. However, the moment this commoner addressed the boy, his demeanor completely changed. With an arrogant tone, the prince ordered the man to leave, saying that his head hurt from the smell of sweat. This attitude left the two confused, so the prince stated that he would love to learn the technique, but as a member of the royal family, he could not be instructed by someone like that. In this case, the protagonist looks at his subordinate, and the two come up with an idea to solve this arrogance. Shortly after, the haughty prince is made to squat with a heavy load and begins to pay for all his sins. Already extremely tired, the boy says he can no longer squat because he can't feel his thighs. Ma, on the other hand, carries much more weight than the boy with a smile on his face while mocking the young man's suffering. Then, to escape this torment, the prince admits he was wrong and, while apologizing, begs for the weight to be reduced. As expected, the solution to the boy's complicated personality was right there. With the boy almost fainting from exhaustion on the ground, our hero recalls that he had been mistreated his entire life for having the blood of the deposed crown prince. And faced with this, he questions how he could subject his servant to the same unfair treatment that he regularly experiences. Knowing that such injustice happens even worse because May is also the son of a concubine. In response, the prince says he does this kind of thing because if he doesn't, he can't bear the injustice done to him. In this case, the boy questions what he can learn by mastering this discipline, as his older brother and the second one are already better than him at it. Moreover, he will never be able to get involved in governmental affairs because he has lived his whole life under the watchful eyes of others so as not to become a threat to the throne. With this story being told, the boy begins to cry, saying he can't do anything to relieve his frustration and anxiety except mistreat others. Even after hearing the boy's account, Choi states that as a member of the royal family, he cannot behave this way because the wrath of the royal family is too great for a commoner. In such a case, Susan sets aside his pride and apologizes, saying he will behave better in the future, which leaves the two satisfied. Then, in response, the hero asks the prince to learn the 3 fundamentals of bench press, squat, and deadlift with Mr. Ma. Continuing the moment the boy reaches a combined weight of around 400 kilograms, Chota will consider putting Susan in charge of the methodology within the palace. This proposal leaves the boy somewhat confused, so the hero asks if the prince has proven the effectiveness of his method, because someone who comes and goes in the palace must master self-conduct and body preparation, as well as the 4 books and 5 classics. With this, he says that the person in this position will be called a trainer, something that will be necessary since one person alone cannot distribute the teaching. Then, in a general context, Choi explains that eventually the boy could become the king's trainer, and at that moment, no one will be able to point a finger at him. These words make the deposed prince's son emotional as he finally finds a glimmer of hope. While crying, he asks if there is really hope and explains that out of shame from others, he never even learned the 3 classics. Choi, in turn, states that this won't be a problem because he, along with his subordinate, will help. Moreover, he explains that His Majesty is creating a new set of characters that will help with the learning of scriptures. The letters were called the correct sounds for the instruction of the people, because the country's language was different from that of the Middle Kingdom, with many people unable to express themselves. For this purpose, the king announced that he was creating a set of 28 new characters out of compassion, a set that would properly teach the people. Because of his words, to correctly record the people's voices in themselves is something that will greatly benefit the world. On another day back at home, Choi's son greets him with a smile. With open arms, the protagonist offers to hold his son along with their pet kitten. In Choi's arms, the child asks why his uncle is always lying down when he sees him and mentions that the other day he was begging for his life to be spared. In this case, it is explained to the child that there is no gain without pain, and that muscles need to be sore to grow. Hearing this, the child comments to his uncle Susan that he is amazing because everyone lies down after training, but he can sit up. However, the prince responds that it's not amazing at all because he started later than the others, which doesn't allow him to lie down even if he wanted to. Changing the subject, he says it would be good if the boy learned some discipline, even though he's too young to read, and unexpectedly, the child shows that he already has a book. Seeing this, Susan asks since when the child knows how to read, but the boy ignores the question and simply asks if his uncle wants to take a look at the book. The hero, in turn, thinks that his life used to be all about bars and dumbbells, but now he has a 5-year-old child to care for. Unlike now, his life in the modern era seems like a simple dream to him. Anyway, exercise has even taken over his family's daily life, with his wife also practicing and being happy about improving. However, after a series of stiff-leg deadlifts, the girl's eyes suddenly began to close and she fainted, causing the protagonist great concern. He grabbed the woman in his arms, asking if she was okay, but she said she couldn't keep steady because suddenly, dizziness took over. Furthermore, the girl also says she's feeling nauseous, something that those observing the scene started to speculate about. In this case, the hero states that it's probably a temporary symptom caused by a lack of air, which led to a reduced flow to the brain. Fortunately, he was by her side. Otherwise, she could have been seriously injured in the fall. Faced with this, the boy thinks that the more people exercise, the more they get hurt, and he looks for a solution to this. Later, Susan says that he would like his brother to meet a certain person, and when asked who it is, he states that the person's name is Woo Hyun-gyu. He passed the military exam and worked as a soldier in the military garrison. Recalling the hero's feats at the strength demonstration event, it's said that the man was also challenged and managed to lift a stone similar in size to an adult. However, right after, he fell forward and was later dismissed for not being able to straighten his back properly. The hero, in turn, says he's heard that boy's name somewhere before. And the prince continues, saying that Wu during the coup was the military officer who managed to suppress Yi Sai's rebellion. With this, Choi asks if what's being said is that a person who reached a relatively high position received a military title but got injured. In this case, the protagonist does pull-ups at high speed and thinks about the matter, considering that it might be something that's his fault. Struggling to keep up with his relative, Susan comments that having heard the hero cured his majesty, he believed that this could be replicated. Finally, it is said that this man is naturally very vigorous, so it will probably be much easier to heal him. Later, in another region, a man slams a cup on the table, saying it's all the fault of the great Prince Suang. This is Wu, who is getting drunk out of frustration, and with a shout, he questions how the prince can turn someone into a healthy man with something like this. However, a colleague warned him to be careful with his words because His Majesty learned the discipline created by the prince, which places him in a high rank. Unconcerned, the boy breaks the cup in anger and says he would like to ask the great prince, if he ever meets him, whether he can lift the same weight as he did. Because to the boy, the rumored feats are impossible, so he starts slandering the prince, leaving his colleague very frightened. In this case, suddenly the hero appears behind him with a serious expression, stating that the weight lifted overhead was actually half of what was mentioned. This scares the warrior so much that he almost faints, and the protagonist asks to have a conversation with the boy. After examining the boy, Choi understands that the injury is in a serious state because he has even gained weight in an attempt to heal quickly. Additionally, he heard that Wu didn't stop riding horses even after the injury because his weight was increasing and he didn't want that to happen. Given this, the chances of recovery are slim, and Choi explains that the boy's condition worsened because he trained while injured. In desperation, Wu asks if there is still a way to heal, and with a smile, the hero says there is, but he cannot guarantee a complete recovery. With no other options, the boy decides to follow the proposed method, starting with knee push-ups. Next, the two do a back stretch, diligently and calmly training the body. After the training, the boy asks if what they did really strengthens the body. In this case, Choi explains that he cannot pass on his method because Wu will not be able to lift heavy weights. It's said that he will improve from now on, but because he spent so much time without seeking help, a full recovery is unlikely. Faced with this cruel fate, the warrior asks if there is another way because he won't be able to bear living without being able to act like a man. He also mentions that his actions will embarrass his wife, and hearing this, our hero remembers what happened to his own wife not long ago. In this case, he says he wants to ask Wu Zhang something, proposing to find ways to heal based on his methodology. The boy thinks that what's being proposed is for him to become a doctor, something that will be impossible because he has never read any medical books. However, it's said that even doctors don't know the details about muscles, which is why many people receive incorrect prescriptions. A rehabilitation doctor must understand the relationship between muscles and the skeleton, so hearing this, Wu changes his opinion about the prince, seeing him as someone intelligent. In any case, the hero believes that everything will be fine as long as the boy keeps his mouth shut, and shortly after, Wu begins his training. Seeing this, Choi thinks that he is slowly gathering disciples because with the invention of Hangul, the concept of the technique will spread quickly. And at this rate, people will start exercising outdoors naked. In this case, it's necessary to find a fabric that anyone can easily buy and wear. With his wife as the seamstress, a shirt is hastily made, but its quality still proves to be good, and since it's an easily obtainable fabric, it can be reused. His wife, in turn, questions why he is doing this since the fabric used is usually common among the peasants. She continues her questioning, but everything changes when the protagonist asks what she thinks of his clothing. The wife is completely amazed and asks what kind of clothing this is because it's the first time she's seen something like this. In this case, the hero informs her that it's an exclusive outfit for exercise developed by him, and cotton was chosen because it's easy to obtain. Moreover, at the moment, this is the most comfortable material for athletic activities. However, for now, the nobles may not want to wear it because they are not familiar with the texture. With this, the girl apologizes for her misjudgment and says that from the way her husband moves, the fabric really seems to be good for exercising. In this case, the tailor is asked to make some extra pieces using this model. Thus, the cotton that was frequently used by the peasants was used to make exercise clothing. Later that night, with an open book, a scholar is impressed with the incredible content found in the method of the bodybuilding secretary. On the same day, inside the Jinwon temple, a man questions the gentleman named Seong Sammun, who is reading, asking if he isn't too focused on his studies. This is because the scholar had been in the Hall of Merit for 23 hours. In light of this, the man apologized for overexerting himself so late at night. The other boy, on the other hand, is his junior scholar named Shin Sukju, who, given his colleague's behavior, asks why he is so focused on his studies. Seong Sammun, in turn, explains that a relative of the royal family needs to set an example and has no time to waste. This is because many are already ahead of him, and after encountering the content of Prince Jin Suang's book, even after reading just a little, the man already liked the material. In any case, it is asked what Dan Gai is doing, and it is said that he is doing something called push-ups. Seong comments that on second thought, this boy in front of him disappeared at dawn and only returned after taking a bath. In this case, he is asked if he was doing a mountain run according to the book, but he says that he replaced that exercise with jumping rope. Hearing this, Shin states that he doesn't think this book is as incredible as they say because, aside from the art of bodybuilding, the book is a compilation of what they already know. However, the junior student from the noble rune, Hawiji, warns that the gentleman should not underestimate the book that the crown prince sent them. With this, the two begin to look at each other with hostility, leaving Seong quite embarrassed in the background. Because of the tense atmosphere in the room, the gentleman states that both of them are too agitated and suggests that they stop for today to discuss the book the next day. Thus, the advice is heeded, and the next day, the same gentleman asks Dan, the one who read the book the most, for his opinion on it. The boy then states that this discipline believes that valuing the body given by one's parents is not enough, focusing instead on making it stronger. Shin, in turn, has a doubt because he says that a text contains the words of a sage, and from his previous knowledge, a crown prince was not such a person. Seong also thinks this way and adds that the basic way to show value is to ascend in the world and gain fame, leaving no purpose for bodybuilding. Moreover, he mentions that according to the first volume, it was said that small illnesses would disappear, and they would not get tired easily, even in extreme conditions. However, the man is still doubtful if this is correct because, although he doesn't believe focusing on cause and effect is a bad thing, what bothers him most is the existence of a discipline that requires expensive equipment to be practiced. In light of this, Shin comments that from what he's hearing, the body can change correctly, but up to this exact moment, he hasn't seen transformed people. And understanding that his colleagues are ignorant of what is happening around the world, Dan decides to explain the case of His Majesty. To illustrate, he asks if the men are trying to look down on the king, which makes them very scared. The boy then explains that His Majesty has transformed quickly since learning the bodybuilding secretary, being more active than in his youth. Moreover, not all the theories in the book may be correct, but they certainly make the body stronger. Thus, the boy asks if being able to move normally after a long day of work wouldn't also help in their studies. In this case, Seong is startled and asks if the boy is implying that they should take the equipment to the Jingwen temple. However, Dan explains that if the situation isn't suitable, they can use stones or small logs, and explains that if someone doesn't want to do it, they don't have to. 8 days later, as suggested, the scholars put the boy's plan to make their own equipment into practice. Seon was the first to get tired and say he couldn't take it anymore, questioning the method's effectiveness. With a shout, he says he can't take it anymore, and quickly everyone enters the temple, preferring to study rather than exercise. In response, Dan wipes the sweat from his face and understands that in the end, everyone gave up. In his mind, he thinks he has seen people change due to the bodybuilding secretary's book, so he decides to practice diligently. And after much time dedicated, a healthy body will be made to help with his studies and daily life. In August 1441, on an ordinary afternoon, the protagonist states that the inventor worked hard. This is because he believed that creating a shoulder press device and a seated row device would be difficult. In this case, Jay makes his usual psychotic expression, saying that everything is thanks to his work, which everyone knows is driven by a certain motivation. With tremendous insincerity, the inventor smiles and asks if it isn't natural for someone who receives a scholarship to obey royal orders. He then mentions that the men from the Inspector General's office worked the hardest because they provided the resources to test the device. With that, the hero enters the hall responsible for testing, telling you that he came to see the completed machines. However, upon entering the room, the inspector's soldiers become extremely frightened and anxious and request to make a report that they have already proven the device's stability. In this case, they ask the prince to step onto the device and perform the exercise himself. And after testing, the hero believes he should have his older brother perform the 3 big exercises while trying out the equipment. Supporting from behind the bench press, the protagonist encourages his brother to put in a little more effort, and finally, he manages to lift the bar. With this, the boy is able to increase his level in the bodybuilding secretary, reaching a total of 190 kilograms in the 3 big exercises. After his achievement, the prince comments that it feels different when recognized by the creator of the method and asks if he will soon reach 250 kilograms. In this case, the hero replies that they don't know exactly how quickly people's muscles grow, and he himself managed to grow until he reached the 300 kilogram goal. However, Choi says that since then, his muscles haven't grown any further. He possesses the body of Prince Sarang with tremendous talent and experience from the modern era, and although his brother is a descendant of King Taejo, he still lacks skill. Given this, it's likely that the boy's progress will take at least 2 years and at most 5 to reach the proposed goal. However, how long it will take is not something to focus on, as the method is meant to be practiced continuously. The next morning, back in the hero's quarters, he is caring for his wife, who is in a poor condition, lying in bed. His wife apologizes for worrying her husband and explains that she has been having morning sickness for a while and can't even eat. She apologizes again, but mentions that she has pork ready, so the hero understands that his wife has only been eating non-greasy foods lately. With that, he gets the hint and decides not to stay idle, rushing out to get some pork for his sick wife. Later, At a place suitable for buying meat, Choi explains to the seller that it will be used for consumption and asks to see the largest pig. In this case, with a smile, the merchant points to one of his fattest pigs. However, our hero believes that the seller is mocking him, which the merchant quickly denies, fearing for his life. The seller asks if the meat from his pig doesn't seem both firm and tender at the same time. Moreover, he claims this is the best pig in all 8 provinces. Nevertheless, Choi still couldn't believe that the animal before him was truly an adult pig. Definitely, that wouldn't work, and the hero would need a larger animal to feed his wife. On another evening, a man introduces himself as Kim Jong-seo, a humble servant who defeated the northern barbarians and returned to the capital. He is a tiger of the dynasty, skilled in martial arts and military strategy. With this, the king remarks that winter is approaching and the barbarians won't be able to move easily. Having his achievements recognized, Kim bows, saying that all of his deeds are thanks to the esteemed grace of his majesty. As the evening event continues, Choi approaches the gentleman, asking if he can serve him a drink, which is accepted. Kim then states that he has heard the rumors about the prince and believes that his presence can be compared to that of the greatest general in the world. The hero thanks him for the compliments but mentions that he didn't build muscles to shoot a bow or swing a sword. However, the warrior asks if the hero didn't send something more reliable than a bow and sword to the north, leaving him quite confused. In this case, he explains that he is talking about spirit, the distilled drink made from the fermentation of raw materials. He said he had his doubts when they suddenly received this strong liquor in the capital, but they were told it was an invention of His Highness. Moreover, they were instructed to use it to clean wounds with a clean cotton cloth, and thanks to this, the number of soldiers with festering wounds decreased. In his thoughts, the hero believes that this might be the reason why there was no rust in the still and is pleased that the invention is being used so effectively. However, it is said that the fact that the liquor was sent wasn't necessarily a good thing because the northern soldiers often drank to ward off the cold. There were many times when they got into trouble for drinking too much, since mixing the liquor with water produces alcohol. With this, Choi asks how the problem was resolved, and the gentleman explains that they added a bitter herb called wormwood to the drink. After that, even if they tried to drink secretly, the soldiers had no choice but to spit it out. This story lightens the mood with laughter, so Kim asks his colleague Lee Won-bong to bring a cup of tea as well. However, the name of this person caught the protagonist's attention. Lee Won-bong, with his incredible strength, also played an important role in subduing the barbarians. In response to Kim's request, the young man declines, saying that he uses his strength only for the benefit of His Majesty the King. Nevertheless, now that 2 strong men have met, the elder suggests that they must have much to talk about. Then the older man mentions that he has to learn new writings from His Majesty and leaves, leaving the 2 alone. Activating his trainer's eye and scanning the warrior's body, Choi realizes that this is the first time since he arrived in Joseon he has met someone similar to himself. His entire physicality was extremely impressive, making him an incredible martial artist. According to the story, when Suryang ascended to the throne and was in danger of being purged, he attempted to bolster the army by gathering the Jurchens from Hamgyal province. However, it is said that he was killed by his subordinate generals, and in the end, the rebellion failed. But even so, he is said to be the most powerful person in history in terms of strength. With this, Choi begins to worry about Yu's expression towards him and wonders if the young man came there because he had something to say. He believes that everything is very strange, but still he thinks it's understandable because if the story follows as it did, he will end up dying by his hands. Ye, in turn, comments that the news about the prince's immense strength has spread even to the north, which he considers an embarrassing situation. Nonetheless, the warrior says he has many questions about the bodybuilding secretary and asks if it would be acceptable to visit him later. In his mind, the hero believes that competing in strength here would make many people uncomfortable, so he understands that it's common sense and accepts the request. With this, Choi begins to think that the warrior might be a better person than he initially thought, and the next morning, Yi shows up, asking if that is the prince's residence. Just the presence of the man is enough to make the hero's 2 disciples feel intimidated. In any case, he states that he has already read the bodybuilding secretary and asks if that thing in Susan's hand is a small dumbbell, which is confirmed. In this case, the warrior asks to take a look, and since it's an object made of concentrated cast iron, the boy asks him to be careful. Holding the dumbbell in his hands, Yi realizes that it definitely weighs much more than it looks. This surprises Susan because he can barely do rows with that 10-kilogram dumbbell, and the man in front of him on his first try is doing a bicep curl. Getting straight to the point, Ye recalls that the prince used 375 kilograms to perform the 3 big exercises. In this case, he asks how much he could lift if he decided to perform the 3 big exercises as well. Rather than asking, the warrior begins to have his question answered in practice. He starts with a deadlift and realizes that it definitely requires a lot of strength, which leaves Susan very scared as he can't even compare. Soon, the warrior drops the weight on the ground and Choi congratulates the man for being able to lift a total of 260 kilograms across the 3 big exercises. With this, he thinks that in this era, it wouldn't be strange for someone to call a soldier like this a person with divine power. However, with a keen eye, Choi notices that something about the bodybuilding secretary was bothering the warrior. In response, he denies it, saying he has learned a lot. However, the protagonist asks him to be honest because since developing the study, he has already identified some flaws. In this case, he recalls what the king said about the great prince inventing the method to perfect the body, which can be used in the military arts. Hearing this, the hero asks if the warrior is thinking that using this method in the military would be quite difficult. However, he explains that when it comes to bodybuilding, the focus is on increasing muscle mass, which isn't necessary for wielding weapons. After all, a specific type of body is needed to wield weapons, and with this explanation, the protagonist believes he has heard this somewhere before. This perspective that building muscles is merely decorative is seen as a valid viewpoint, and furthermore, he recommends eating meat daily, something that obviously common soldiers won't be able to do, so since military and academic literature follow different paths, the method is only suitable in the academic realm. Therefore, after saying that the bodybuilding secretary is not something practical, the warrior leaves, leaving behind the protagonist who is irritated, thinking that he knows nothing about military literature. The great Prince Saya may not be a military man, but Choi Yeonjik was a former member of the Korean forces and a reserve sergeant before moving to another world. It is explained that our hero's first experience was in the military, and he commits to inventing a new method for soldiers within 3 years. Back in the central region of the palace, the king is reading a scroll with great attention. The crown prince asks his father if there is any problem. In this case, he says it is a letter from the Ming Empire stating that they want to purchase around 100 bars of soap. This is great news, making it worthwhile that they cultivated uwudia trees, the material used to make the soap. However, they also want to meet the great Prince Suyang, the one who created the soap, and the king doesn't understand why they want to see him since he has no connection with the empire. The crown prince, however, believes that everything is going well, and among the royal members, they say that his brother has a broader vision than anyone else. Thus, he suggests sending him to the Ming Empire as a representative of the nation. After another set of bench presses, Susan is quite tired, and our hero is proud of what he sees. In about a year of study, the boy has already achieved a total of 190 kilograms in the 3 big exercises, making it likely that he will become an assistant instructor next year. This makes the boy happy, but in his opinion, he doesn't believe he will be able to catch up to the crown prince when he becomes an assistant instructor. Changing the subject, Susan asks if his brother remembers the day he tried to take a concubine, and Choi recalls that the boy tried but gave up to focus. Unexpectedly, the boy states that he has accepted a concubine again because the people around him were anxious that he still didn't have children. In the end, Susan accepted the daughter of the Yun family from Hamyang, and with that, Choi recalls that it is a common practice to take a concubine if one has no children after the age of 20. In this era, people usually have children before they even turn 20, and King Sejong himself was very worried before his older brother had a child at 23. In this case, the boy asks if there is any problem, and Choi thinks apprehensively that Susan wouldn't believe him if he said the boy's father would attack his wife. So the hero has an idea, and saying he read the fortune based on the Book of Changes, warns that after taking his second wife, a man-made disaster will occur. This prediction leaves the boy a little confused because it's not a natural disaster but one caused by humans. With that, Choi asks if his brother knows how to prevent a man-made disaster, and without delay, he explains that it is resolved using physical force. Hearing this, Susan says it makes sense because a man-made disaster could be something like repelling a thief in self-defense. However, the method for a woman to develop her strength was still unclear in the boy's mind. In response, the hero said there is a way, and asking him to carefully watch the martial art he will demonstrate, Choi asks to be grabbed by the collar. With this, our hero explains that when someone is about to hit another, they usually grab the collar first. And Susan agrees, saying he has grabbed many people by the collar, which he is not proud of. With his brother holding tightly his shirt, the time to demonstrate his martial art finally arrives, and with a joint-fisted strike, Choi completely disarms the threat. Initially, the boy is confused, but soon begins to scream in pain. As he falls to the ground, he asks what just happened, and it is explained that he collapsed because his joints were struck. Since his brother has already experienced the effectiveness of his martial arts, he is asked to bring the concubine to the training field as his wife can help her. A few days later, a training session between the protagonist's wife and his brother's wife begins. However, the concubine seemed to be taking it very easy as she had not yet caught the training rhythm. After the exercises, it is asked if Lady Yun had any trouble learning, but she understood everything without any problem. However, she still questioned why she was being taught this, and in response, Susan said without revealing everything that it would be of great help to her one day. With that, time passes, and now it is June 1442, along with an announcement to the second prince. Desperately, the servant explains that something terrible has happened to His Highness, the great Prince Susan. So it is known that the day finally arrived, and the servant continues explaining that he was assaulted by a family member, suffering an injured arm and damaged teeth. This definitely takes the hero by surprise because his brother was injured so severely even after learning the basic arts of self-defense. Then the narrative returns to the fateful day of the event to illustrate what happened. Lying in his quarters, the prince's father was drunk while mocking his son for studying so diligently. Out of boredom, he asked for some tea, which was promptly brought to him. Without delay, Yvonne appears with her father-in-law's tea. However, the man knocks the tea out of her hand. With the girl on the ground, the lord complains that the girl only knows how to take care of her husband and also complains about the time he had to wait, saying it was too long. He continues to curse the girl for her actions, which in his mind were offensive, but something catches his attention. The sight of the girl, soaked from the spilled tea and completely defenseless before his eyes, stirred something within him. In this case, with improper thoughts, the man said that his son had brought home a very beautiful child, as his taste was similar to his own. He then grabbed the girl by her clothes, and as she screamed for the man not to do it, she used what she had learned and struck him with a headbutt. The headbutt knocked out some of the man's teeth. Additionally, she also put into practice an immobilization technique with her arm. However, due to her high adrenaline levels, she accidentally overdid it. Inevitably, because he is someone of high rank, this case is brought to the king's court. He asks the chief inquisitor to report what the royal investigative agency has discovered. In this case, the inquisitor explains that they concluded that the great prince Yang Liang was assaulted by a concubine and suffered severe injuries. Before anything else, the king says he has something to ask and explains that he wants to know how Yun managed to defeat a man who knows martial arts. He then explains that the girl was trained by the protagonist and his disciple, having learned techniques designed to kill others. He further states that he is only alive because he knows martial arts. With the skills of an ordinary person, he could be dead. Finally, the abuser asks the king not only to punish the girl, but also those who taught her these lethal techniques. Upon hearing this, the hero recalls that this man used to say he was his favorite nephew. Now he's doing this, and at that moment, he is questioned by the king. In his defense, Choi explains that he only taught the girls self-defense techniques, which the king initially accepts. Thus, he states that rather than being a technique to kill people, what the prince is saying is that it is a method to protect the body. In this case, the king asks the other officials what they think about who is at fault. The chief state counselor, Wang Hui, believes that considering the prince's usual behavior, he may have tried to do something. The Minister of Justice, Yu Gaimun, however, is of the opinion that even if the sin is great, the concubine committed a crime of ethical violation by harming her father-in-law. This definitely causes discomfort for the king because even though he is aware of his brother's actions, there are still laws in the country. In Zhejiang, a person who commits a crime of ethical violation is punished as severely as treason, with the consequence being the death penalty. This situation is seen by His Majesty as quite troubling, but a punishment would have to be given regardless. So a punishment of 20 lashes is given to concubine Yun, to be carried out immediately. With that, the girl is laid on the ground to receive her punishment. Faced with this, the girl becomes desperate, and soon the whip comes toward her back, which she awaits anxiously with closed eyes. However, before striking her, the soldier hesitates for a moment and then hits the girl, causing her to groan in pain. But from a distance, the prince questions what the soldier was doing, as it was clear that he was going easy on her, so he orders the man to hit her properly. Without delay, the illegitimate prince pushes the servant aside, saying he will do the job himself. Then the lord picks up the rod from the ground and raises it to strike with all his anger. But at the last moment, the king himself interrupts his brother, telling him to calm down. This action startled the prince because, since they were children, his brother had never been able to compete in strength, but now he managed to stop his strike. Faced with this, he asks His Majesty what this action means, considering that the woman who wronged him, his father-in-law, is going unpunished. However, these words only irritate Sejong further, and losing his patience, he orders his brother to shut up and asks if he wishes to live in exile. After his threat, the king drops the rod, causing his brother to fall to the ground, and then reminds him that their father, King Taejong, did not allow the prince to enter the capital. Nevertheless, he still had mercy and allowed his brother to stay with him. It is said that even after committing all kinds of misdeeds in Aishin, it was the king who tried to dissuade the other subjects from sending him into greater exile. Therefore, this will be the last time any mercy is shown to this abusive lord. With that, he orders his soldiers to place the great Prince Yang Liang under house arrest. In light of this, the prince tries to resist and beg for mercy, but even after calling his brother by his personal name, his relative does not respond. In this case, the soldier from before returns, telling His Majesty that he will continue with the execution of the sentence. However, by this point, the sentence is annulled, and the king states that they may untie the girl. In the face of this immeasurable act of kindness, Susan thanks him with all this pure sincerity. Then, understanding that this was a truly unfortunate incident, the king prepares a new residence for the prince to move into quickly. Noticing that the boy must have already gone through a lot, he tells him not to worry about anything and just relax, which Susan gratefully accepts. Not long after the incident of the great Prince Yang Liang's house arrest, the protagonist's second child was born healthy. One day, everything was peaceful as usual, but a visitor appeared at the hero's house for the first time. After giving the proper greetings to the prince, the boy introduces himself as Wiji Subanim Dam Ti, a member of the Jinju lineage. Choi remembers that the two often met on the way to the Hall of Merit, but he had heard that the boy was studying at the temple. In this case, he asks what the boy is doing there, and Choi also notices that the boy's physique had changed so much that he almost didn't recognize him. In response, Dan explains that his body was weak when he started his studies at the temple, so he decided to follow the bodybuilding secretary. He says that at first he felt like he was going to faint, but soon he got used to it, and after some time he decided to go to the creator's house to thank him personally. Hearing this, the hero comments that there is no need for such formality because in his mind it's not as if he's teaching anything. In this case, with a smile, Dan asks if it would be acceptable for him to join the protagonist in the bodybuilding regimen. This question makes the hero thoughtful, as he would have agreed if it had been anyone other than Dan, who was one of the 6 martyred ministers. Since the boy is a man of great ability, if he joins Choi's plan, the country could suffer significant losses. With this, the protagonist states that he is concerned that Dan is already on a difficult path, to which the boy responds that there is no need to worry. This is because, in his mind, compared to others, his talent is nothing special. Thus, Choi asks if the boy's problem isn't in making comparisons. In any case, he asks if Dan really wants to become a trainer, and without delay, the question is confirmed. Then, with a smile, the boy informs him that he has even told his superior that he would be leaving the Noble Halls group. Due to his high insistence, the duo inevitably heads to the gym. Introducing himself as the new student, Dan says it is a pleasure to meet all his seniors. Suicide in turn comments that although the boy has started his career as a public servant, his experience in bodybuilding is still lacking. In light of this, he advises the novice to observe them, and he accepts without hesitation. Although he finds it somewhat embarrassing, the novice decides to first show what he has managed to develop on his own so far. With that, he approaches one of the pieces of equipment and says he will start his demonstration with pull-ups. In that case, Susan asks the boy not to overdo it, as it's difficult for someone just starting to build their body to do a proper pull-up. He continues, saying that he studied this for half a year, but can still only manage 3 or 4 at most. But when he opens his eyes, he's faced with the reality that the novice is doing more than double his maximum. In this case, trying to defend his honor, Susan claims that the boy's arms aren't fully extended, saying that proper form is what really matters. Watching from a distance, Choi smiles, believing that this new disciple will be a good motivation for everyone to push themselves to their limits. Later, our hero observes the kingdom's natural landscape from a veranda along with the novice. Dan in turn praises the view and comments that if they extract oil from all the Euodia trees, they could obtain about 7,500 liters. It's said that they could receive a lot of silver if they make soap from it and sell it to the Ming Empire, but the hero says he wants something more precious than silver. This statement leaves Dan quite puzzled about what could be more valuable than silver. Then the hero states that what he truly wants is the best for the future of his country. On another morning, the king comments that he heard that the protagonist cured a man named Wu's back through the bodybuilding secretary. Moreover, the fact that he successfully treated his father-in-law already filled him with pride, so it was decided to reward the hero's service, which he gratefully acknowledged. Given the success of the method's promotion before departing for the Ming Empire, Choi is asked to visit the chief of the state council, Wang Hui. He requested resignation last month, citing his curved back and weak eyes as the reason. They can't do anything if it's irreversible, but they would still like the prince to visit him personally. Upon arriving at the chief of state's residence, the staff were surprised to see the great prince before them, becoming quite flustered. And the protagonist in turn begins to think that the atmosphere in the place is somewhat strange. In the man's quarters, one of the servants apologizes for Huang having to lie down even in the presence of such a distinguished guest. This is what he was saying in a low, trembling voice for his servant to relay. Continuing with the translation, the man says he wishes to serve his majesty, but ever since he turned 70, his back began to curve and his limbs have deteriorated. With this being what the man is saying, Choi comments that the king ordered him to take care of Huang's body, but given the extent of the problem, he doesn't know what to do. Despite everything, an order is a royal order, and if the lord doesn't know his body better, he won't be able to comfortably play even a board game. With that, the hero suggests, with ulterior motives, that it might be a good idea to let Lord Mang Chung's eldest son keep this beautiful Go board. However, Choi notices that despite the lord's condition, the board is still warm as if someone had just played on it. In the end, all he can say is that it's impossible to restore the aging of the man's body with his knowledge. However, a way to help care for the body can be taught instead of completely curing it. Later, Juan is happy that the prince is putting so much effort into an old man like him and feels embarrassed that his body isn't keeping up. Continuing to translate what the Lord wants to say, he's ashamed of his current situation, but is willing to use the exercise method to stay in shape. Troy also hopes that the chief of the state council can recover his health to the fullest extent possible. In this case, he advises the servant that it's good to keep the room warm to protect the body, though any excess could become harmful. For some time, Choi had been wondering why the room was so warm that even the Go board was, which left the servant quite anxious. The board gave off a feeling of having just been used for a game. But in any case, with a smile, the hero decides to take his leave for now. After his investigation, he reports that the chief of state is not in a critical condition, but since he is already very old, his method is not very effective. In light of this, the king comments that it would have been good if they had intervened 10 years earlier and is saddened by the situation of his loyal companion. If that gentleman had taken care of his body earlier, he could have participated in governmental affairs for another 10 years. 10 years ago, the chief of state was 69 years old, so the king thinks he should have discussed more things with him when he still had energy. Sejong continues lost in thoughts about how the future could have been different and realizes that the saying, "cultivate youth 100 years earlier," refers to this. Changing the subject, he asks his son how things are going with his disciples. The hero then explains that he has gathered good disciples and that they are slowly showing promising results. Additionally, the king recalls that it hasn't been long since the meeting with Kim in the northern region, making it a good time to think about ways to strengthen the northern soldiers as well. Choi understands, and in another question, the king asks about the preparations for the Ming Empire, wondering if the boy will go to Henan after passing through Beijing. The answer is affirmative, and then Sejong comments that from what he has heard, his son's goal is to travel across half of the empire. It's said that the reason he will travel through the Nanjing and Hangzhou regions is due to livestock farming. It's noted that the pigs of this time resemble toy pigs, so if he brings pigs from the Ming Empire, people will be able to consume protein regardless of status. He continues by saying that in China, meat always means pork, and the pigs from that region are certainly an easy breed to raise and gain weight quickly. The king looks with some suspicion and comments that there must be another objective, because livestock farming alone isn't enough. With that, Choi thinks that from his father's perspective, he will be away from his son for a year, making it difficult to convince him. The Ming Empire has vast land and a large population, which sparks the boy's interest in cultivating numerous grains and vegetables. Thus, he would also like to stop by Nanjing to pick up some books. Hearing this, Sejong becomes somewhat interested and states that this place has been a capital passed down from generation to generation since the Southern Song dynasty, with many books there. In this case, he asks if the boy believes the chief eunuch of the Ministry of Rites will help him on his journey, to which the protagonist believes he will. It's said that Wang Zhen is already someone who enjoys power to the point of being called father by the ministers. If an offer is harmful to the country, he will reject it, but if it's beneficial, he will gladly assist the hero on his journey. The king says he hasn't met him before despite his bad reputation. The warning to be cautious is still pertinent. Changing the subject, Sejong recalls that his granddaughter was born recently and asks if the protagonist has spoken with the family, which is obviously confirmed. With that, after a certain period, the time finally comes for Choi to depart, along with farewells to his wife and his esteemed companions. Being someone very close to the hero, his wife cries, but his son maintains a cheerful expression, not fully understanding. Despite this, the girl becomes anxious and decides to ask how Choi could miss their daughter's first birthday, and with no other choice, he explains that others will attend. In this case, since it's a national matter, the wife cries, saying that His Majesty is very strict, and Choi feels embarrassed because people are watching. To resolve the conflict, the crown prince steps forward and asks the hero not to worry, saying that as his disciple, he will take care of his family. Thus, Choi simply thanks him, saying he looks forward to hearing about it when he returns. The prince then asks if his brother is trying to take advantage of him as he did with the second commander, which the hero denies with laughter. By the way, our protagonist says he heard that the inventor took his first vacation in 15 years. With that, Jong smiles, saying it's all thanks to His Highness for bringing the matter to His Majesty's attention. Finally, Choi's son hands a dumbbell to his father, showing that his strength has increased. The protagonist then pulls his son onto his lap and joyfully congratulates him on the good news, saying they will do bench presses together when he returns. This entire moment was quite happy, but the hero remembers his conversation with the king. Sejong commented that all these plans of his sons were quite mysterious to him, making him curious about what was going on in his mind. In this case, the protagonist reconsidered his one and only wish. The wish to make this land where the people live a prosperous and strong one so that no one can underestimate their efforts. Later on the ship, one of the men sneezes, having contracted a common illness at sea. In response, another man comments that it's strange since usually, the stronger your constitution, the harder it is to catch a cold. In this case, the boy explains that he breathed in a lot of cold wind and apologizes for not being strong enough. This situation worries the hero a bit because his interpreter isn't in good condition. He thinks it's a good opportunity to get him to exercise properly and become healthier. This interpreter is the assistant scribe and deputy Shin Sukju. As time passes, the wind shifts the sail's direction, and the protagonist notices from the corner of the boat that he can already see land. With this, he asks if the soap they're carrying is moldy or damaged. Yigai and Pak Gang from the Noble Hall report that they've just checked and confirmed that the quality is good, and the dry weather makes everything even better. Besides them, the group also includes the escort warrior Nam Bin, and the hero feels that things are going well. With an excited expression, the protagonist comments that rumors describe the Ming Empire as the center of the world, and now they will see it with their own eyes. After some time, they disembark and inevitably witness the grandeur of the empire. A vast and beautiful place that, compared to Hanyang, which was relocated less than 50 years ago, shows a massive difference. Many can't believe that this was built by humans, saying it's as if they're looking at the Bakdudagan mountain range, whose height cannot be measured. However, among the impressed, the eunuch Chanching looks at these people with a mocking tone, considering them country folk. Yiga, in turn, asks when they will have an audience with the king, and it's said that he's not someone anyone can meet. In this case, only the Great Prince will have the privilege of meeting the emperor of the region. As for the date, it's said that it will take approximately 40 days for the meeting to take place, which leaves the scribe in despair. By the way, they are asked about the tributes the prince brought, and it's confirmed that they are the ones being carried by the servants. In light of this, Chanshin comments that he tried using the soap for some time, and it was extremely effective for his problems. So even though the product is still a prototype, the protagonist is happy that someone evaluated it positively. Troy continues, explaining that since the existing soap wasn't sufficiently fragrant, this time an improved product is being brought. This makes Chanshin think they might not have enough, but it's said that they prepared 750 kilograms along with some extras available for him to try. The eunuch smells the soap, noticing the light floral fragrance present. Understanding that 750 kilograms of this product are available, he states that it's great that a not-so-prosperous country is setting such a big example. Furthermore, the man comments that he's heard the second son of the king of Joseon looks like a brave general. With this, he says that now, upon closer inspection, the boy's broad shoulders and magnificent arms resemble those of one of the four heavenly kings of Buddhism. However, at that moment, Chanshin's actions are interrupted, and when he questions why, he realizes that his behavior has already crossed the line. Later, inevitably, the fateful day of the meeting arrives, and the protagonist, representing the vassal nation of Joseon, bows to his majesty and greets him. He says that the world is at peace thanks to the king's immeasurable grace and that everything sings his praises, which leaves him tired from all the formalities. In this case, Emperor Yingzong of the Ming Empire comments, impressed, that he's heard the king of Joseon has several exceptional sons. He mentions that the other day when Chanshin brought the soap, all the dirt on his body disappeared, and the fact that a boy was the creator surprised him even more. Anyway, he acknowledges that bringing 750 kilograms of soap, there was difficult and decides that they should discuss the future of commerce elsewhere. However, this decision leaves two of the counselors quite irritated, and the king orders the boy to leave, which confuses him due to the tense atmosphere. Later, while walking through the empire, many people look at the hero's group with malicious intent, and they wonder what's happening. The citizens murmur among themselves, speaking ill of the Joseon country folk, whom they consider provincial. However, the hero still didn't understand the reason for so much hostility, but soon, someone found him. Alongside his men, Chanshin said that he had been expecting the prince. With that, the protagonist bows, saying it's an honor to meet him as thanks to his kindness, he was able to visit his majesty in just 10 days. In this case, Chanshin asks if they know who the person beside him is. Choi explains that according to the rumors they receive, there was a magnanimous lord from the Ministry of Rights, and the subjects called him the Elder. In response, the silver-haired man comments that he has heard stories about the second son of the king of Joseon, but despite his strong physique, he still seems intelligent. It's said that thanks to the soap made in the region, he feels refreshed every day, and in particular, he can't help but be impressed with the quality of the new one. With that, the man asks for a price for purchasing the soap, and Choi informs him that it will depend on the ingredients used. It's mentioned that a bar of soap containing ginseng is worth 10 sacks of rice, while the fragrant soaps are a bit cheaper, costing 6 sacks of rice per piece. In yen, this means each piece is worth about 1 tael of silver, which the prince promptly confirms. Thus, he is asked how much the manufacturing method costs, and the scribe believes the man is being brazen by wanting to steal the recipe as well as the product. Without hesitation, the protagonist reveals that the soaps are made using seaweed from Hamgyal, which impresses the man with how easily the recipe was disclosed. He asks if this isn't their main export item, to which Choi explains that as a member of a vassal state, he's just doing his best to be courteous. However, since it's made from seaweed, production will have to continue in Joseon, as there is a ban on maritime exploitation in the capital. Regardless, the noble asks if it's possible to increase the quantity of soap and bring as much fragrant soap as possible. In this case, our hero asks how much product they're talking about, and the man explains that it's 3,750 kilograms, leaving Choi speechless. Continuing, he says that the new batches need to have the same quality, and gradually, the quantity should be increased as circumstances permit. Anyway, the man believes it's fair to reveal his identity to his future business partner. He is the second son of the king of Joseon. Then the chief eunuch of the Ministry of Rights introduces himself as Wang Zhen. He expresses his happiness that the deal has been concluded smoothly and asks if there is anything else Choi desires, which could be anything within his power. Apologizing, the hero explains that he would like to travel through the Ming Empire and find products to bring back to his country. In light of this, Wang comments that if the boy wants money, he could give him 50,000 nyangs of silver all at once. Initially, the offer tempts the protagonist, but he calms down, remembering that grain seeds and livestock will one day be more valuable than that. Thus, he thanks him for the kind words and assures him that in his hometown they will do their best to send more soap. In any case, the boy believes that this could also be a good idea to return the favor, and he states that he will make the prince's first trip to the Ming Empire as comfortable as a cruise. The scribe, in turn, now believes he understands why the eunuchs are so fascinated with the fragrant soap, which piques the hero's curiosity. It's then explained that in Joseon, eunuchs' genitals are preserved, but in this empire, they are cut off entirely. Without testicles, the protagonist believes it will be difficult to build muscle, but the man explains that their problem has been more about constantly urinating. Thus, their entire bodies eventually began to exude the smell of urine, and pouches or lotions were useless against this unpleasant odor. It was precisely for this reason that they were so eager to get the soap, and the next day, a new situation unfolded. After the main group rode in a beautiful carriage, they disembarked, and a man asked if they were indeed in the presence of the envoy from Joseon. In this case, the man informed them that the chief eunuch had requested to assure there were no interruptions during the journey. However, this dazzling carriage drew a lot of attention for being almost on the same level as the one the prince uses. So Choi questioned whether they could really accept it, and the man, easing the tension, explained that the prince's carriage is nearly twice the size of this one. Once inside the carriage, the speed reached 60 kilometers per hour, which left one of the passengers quite surprised. However, one of them coughs and politely asks to close the window for a moment. Hyuga complains a lot about the trail of dust, saying it's just like in his homeland, which the hero thinks isn't wrong. This is because, excluding ancient Rome, proper paved roads didn't appear until the 20th century, so the windows are closed. The scribe, meanwhile, addresses his highness, questioning why he's sitting against the wall when there's a perfectly good chair available. In this case, Choi comments that when you're in another country, you often miss your parents, so expressing filial piety through your body is his method. One must not neglect the body given by their parents for even a moment and must continue with training. Thus, the reason for advancing his objective finally arrives, and Choi mentions that the boy's belly fat is bulging over his belt. Despite being young, he already has 3 folds of fat on his chin. Additionally, he was coughing a lot on the ship, and as soon as they arrived on land, his knees started hurting and he was out of breath when walking. So it's said that he needs to improve his physical condition to overcome these obstacles. After the boy feels quite affected by having his flaws pointed out, Choi approaches him, saying he has something prepared for him. With a serious look, the protagonist mentions hearing that they have to travel many miles to reach their destination in Chang'an. He then says that the miracle of body shaping can be achieved in 12 days and that if the chubby one is trained by Choi, his success is guaranteed. Obviously, as a good sedentary person, the boy denied his fate until the last second, but he had no choice. Finally, 12 days later in the city of Chang'an, the chubby one had slimmed down completely, and the hero thanked the group for their work, not knowing how to repay their kindness. In response, the person in charge of the carriage stated that it was nothing, as he was simply following the strict orders of the chief eunuch. Someone approaches, asking if they are the envoys from Joseon, as he received a message from the chief eunuch announcing their arrival. They could travel quite a distance, so it was good for them to have a meal. This is the Governor General of Chang'an. The table is set for them with an abundance of food. In front of the exquisite noodles, he wished them a good meal. They had never experienced cuisine like that before, and the noodles were exceptional. It is called sliced noodles, a dish that originated during the Yuan dynasty. The next dish arrives at their table, also very well presented. That is boiled meat, and they are tasting it. While Chuan said that the pork is wonderful, but the same couldn't be said about the beef. He said that the beef tasted like it came from a cow that had died of starvation after being poorly fed its whole life. He deeply regretted that such meat had been so poorly prepared. The cook in the background had to hold back his cleaver. Someone said that there might have been a misunderstanding, but at least they could agree that the pork was tasty. The critic said that if it were this pork, he wouldn't tire of eating it every day of his life, much to the delight of the cook who was watching the meal. Night falls in the city and the full moon illuminates the streets. This is the capital of the Ming Empire, the city of Beijing. They received a message from the Governor General of Chang'an. He said that he had dedicated himself to escorting them and hoped that he would be able to spread good news about him to the sum of heaven. And he would like to know why he is taking care of provincials from a small country. The young man said that when he became a eunuch, he only had 1 nying of silver. But now he's in a position where he could offer even 50,000 nyings of silver. Then he throws the object he had in his hand out the window. It goes rolling across the palace tiles. But there was something he was yearning for. He wants to know how much 50,000 nyings are worth to the second son of the Joseon king. Is that really a pig? Someone asked. Because it was so large that it looked like a boar, the only thing missing were the tusks sticking out of its mouth. The farmer said that his pigs weigh 110 kilos in just 1 year, which left the young man quite impressed. He asked for a piece of the big pig to be cut so they could see the quality of the meat, to the despair of the pig. Even if they only took this pig, it would be enough for a banquet. The servant asked what the intention was of taking so many animals. They should be careful when taking these pigs to Joseon. Before that, they should compare other animals. However, he said that if they took several animals, the mixing of breeds could produce a catastrophic result. People walk through the city center. That is Luoyang, and its center is as bustling with people as Beijing. Seeing the street vendors, he said it was difficult to see those things in the capital, but he already expected that from this city. He said that the way the vendor speaks is peculiar, and he heard rumors about Joseon, but he doesn't know exactly what they are talking about. The vendor says that if he buys his pill, he could get a body similar to Prince Surang's. He was furious to learn that he was using the prince's name to sell those pills, which he claims to have bought the ingredients for from him. Already showing off his physique, he didn't expect the rumors about them to have reached there in less than a month of travel. The servant told His Highness that it would be problematic if envoys caused a commotion in the city. He completely ignored him and said he was just showing off his muscles, much to the servant's dismay. And the vendor continues his talk, saying that whoever eats 100 of those pills would be the strongest person in the world. And he pointed to a big guy next to him, saying that he had eaten 100 of the pills. He emphasized the idea that he had eaten several. In the middle of the crowd, there was a citizen showing off his body, and the onlookers wondered if that was even a person. The vendor said that if he ate just 50, it would have an effect, but he said he didn't need them, because he was there to have his strength competition with the strongest man in the world. It didn't take long for the vendor to realize he was in trouble. At that moment, he scolds the vendor for saying that he bought ingredients from the prince yet can't even recognize him. Even so, the vendor didn't get the message and asked who was bothering him. Flexing his muscles violently, he says that he is none other than the great Prince Siang of Joseon. The vendor soiled his underwear immediately after that introduction. And then he ordered the chubby guy, the supposed tough guy, to take care of that loudmouth immediately. The two collide in the middle of the crowd that was watching. The prince's strength was immense, and he began to overpower Fofuxo's small hands. It didn't take long for Fofinho to be completely bewildered because, despite being bigger, he was much weaker. Soyang took a deep breath and said he would answer his question. As he slammed him towards the ground, he said that he had far more muscles than he did. Once the confrontation ended, Fofinho was on the ground, writhing in pain, while Soyang stood victorious. After that, he began to look around. The deceptive vendor couldn't believe that Fofuxo had lost so easily. They immediately fled the scene, realizing they had messed with the wrong person. Meanwhile, the prince watched the two flee from his overwhelming presence. He flexed his absurdly vascular arm. Afterward, he began to pose amidst the crowd and said that those were the true muscles of Joseon. An impressed old man asked for paper and ink, and the people near him thought he must be a senile pervert. The old man was actually an artist and wanted to use that body as a reference to create a Buddha figure. Other servants finally arrived as they had been searching for the prince, and they asked if he had obtained anything. While posing, he said it was too early to decide on the pig breed, and he wanted to know what his servants had obtained. They had old books which they planned to send back to the country, along with many seeds, but they were unsure how they would fare in the climate there. The prince praised their work and said those were the writings of Baksh. That was an excellent find, and one of the young men thought that the prince was quite the nerd. He mentioned that among the books, there was also one of the life of Han Xin, a general from the Zhou dynasty. Upon hearing that, the other young man became interested as well. Days passed, and they had made some good discoveries in that city. At the moment, they were at a port on Hangzhou Lake. That ship in front of them made turtle ships look like nothing. Impressed by its size, they imagined it must be the largest in the world. The prince said that if they were going to Nanjing, they needed to visit the shipyard that built that ship. One of them mentioned that it had already been 3 months since they arrived there by ship, much to the prince's surprise as it made him miss his family. Meanwhile, life continued in Joseon. The king is asking the prince about the development of the cannons. He considered them too small, perhaps only suitable for scaring enemies and nothing more. However, the prince said that being small, they were maneuverable in battle. In other words, if each soldier had one, they could fire freely, but the king continued to ponder this. In the north of the country, there was a story about someone who was hit by something similar, woke up fine the next day, and even outlived the person who shot at him. The prince said the man was wearing leather and the projectile was a small arrow. If the projectile had been coated with wax, he would have been pierced and wouldn't be alive. Even so, he was thinking of solutions for the counterweight pole that you had given them. He handled it with his hands and carefully analyzed the object to ensure there were no deviations or defects. An old man calmly takes a sip of alcohol. After finishing, he sighs and continues sitting thinking. He was finally having a vacation, but he couldn't stop thinking about His Highness. He wonders what he should do to satisfy the royalty, and a woman passing by thought he was talking to himself. Looking at the doll in front of him, he said that his jokes were going too far, and he told them to stop talking and that he should start drinking too. A man passing by recognized that an authority was seated there and asked what he was doing in a place like that. Chang said there was no need for formalities and asked if he could have a fried fish, to which the man said he would prepare it immediately. Before long, the dish was presented to him. Tasting it, he found the flavor horrible, and the man from the place said he would bring seasoned vegetables because the fish was salted afterward and must have turned out bad. Jang then asked if the fish really turned bad because it was salted afterward. He remembered the prince talking about alcohol and its ability to clean wounds while they were fresh. Jang asked how old the fish was and was informed it had been about 2 days before it became a recipe. He recalled that if the fish was cleaned immediately and salted, the meat could be preserved for almost a month. At sea, the men want to pull the net back using the crane. It doesn't take long for the net to be out of the water, filled with freshly caught fish. Jang orders the men to keep rowing and those on deck to start cleaning the fish and salting them immediately. They will use the pulling motion he learned while exercising. The fish are cleaned and promptly salted. One of the workers asks if that will really make them last so long, and Jang confirms. In fact, it was the first time in 30 years of fishing that the fishermen had caught so many fish at once. With 100 fish, they are already full, but there are about 1,000 of them. With the fish supply increasing, if they stockpile it the right way, soon everyone in Joseon will be able to eat fresh fish. It would be great if they had a sturdy boat to venture further into the open sea. He needed to send a letter to the prince. Inside the house, someone says that a royal order has arrived. It was for Ileom, the prince's disciple, to follow that order. He plans to build a hall to prepare the body, and you should find 20 young men who were eliminated in the magistrate exam. Once that's done, he should teach them how to conduct themselves and how to prepare their own bodies. A month had passed since that order. The servant says it's been a while since he exercised with the prince, to which the younger brother says the older one worked hard for that to happen. The students' eyes light up every time Susan teaches them, but when it's the servant who teaches, they completely ignore him. Susan says that those who do not pass the exam will be sent to the province of Hangul. Upon hearing that, the servant became a bit pensive. The prince asks if the disciples had been sent to that province, because he knew it was very cold there and just thinking about it made him shiver. And now he wants both of them to do a brief warm-up, much to the servant's dismay. Imagining this scene made the servant resolute, and he tells the prince that he cannot let the disciples go to that province. For those lacking in education, weightlifting could be the solution. Under a well-lit sky, they train. Someone asks the disciples what they have learned so far and if they are unable to answer. With great determination, he says that it is still not enough, and it was time for them to add another weight plate. At that moment, the young man says that he knows how to say what they have learned. Approaching the young man, he says that every time the weight increases, he responds well, so he should add more weight. And so it is done. Another weight plate is added. He told them to endure because they wouldn't lose in weightlifting. Merely holding on, the young man says he can't be the only one suffering. Everyone should respond with weightlifting too, and this rumor spread across the provinces of Joseon. They are in Nanjing, the capital of the Ming Empire, and although it is not the capital, it felt very much like one. They got cucumbers there, even though it's not the season, and they should grow rice alongside them. It must be very profitable to plant things other than just rice. The prince thinks that in Joseon, the focus is on rice because survival is one of the most important things. The country's history of invasions contributed to this, leaving no choice but to have a food production system that could support emergencies. Even so, it was time for them to move towards progress. Since they were in Jiangnan, they should try the products from there. Presenting silver, he said they would like to have a banquet and be well treated. The owners of the place were surprised by the amount of money presented, and they briefly exchanged glances after that. The first dish was carp. Fried while it was still alive, it was so fresh. The next was a boneless, crispy-skinned piglet, and they even brought them a turtle soup. It didn't take long for them to eat all of that until they couldn't take any more. They were lying on the floor, impressed by the taste of those wonderful foods and that spectacular cuisine. All of them were quite satisfied after the meal. Now the prince would like to introduce them to someone. At the port of Nanjing, the dock workers are working hard. The prince approaches one of the men there, as he would like to ask him something. He thought the prince was a novice worker and was sure that with a body like that, he would be very useful. He finally reveals his true nature, to the citizens' astonishment. The man is relieved because he almost made a blunder, and the prince asks if he is the one who built the ship for Unit Zheng's expedition. Fang said it was him, and that the sight of that ship heading to the sea was too magnificent. He mentioned that he made a lot of money with that ship, but since there were no more expeditions, the ships eventually reached the end of their useful lives. Since then, he has been making a living by building simpler merchant ships. However, it was natural for him to build immense ships, and he misses doing so. The prince wanted to know if he had built other types of ships, as he had been traveling a lot and was obsessed with the subject. The builder said yes, he had built ships for various different provinces. At that moment, the prince asked if he had plans to build something new once again, as it was unfortunate for his skills to be lost. With seriousness, Fang asked if the intention was for him to move to Joseon to work there. Grateful for the offer, he said his purpose was to build a massive ship, and he couldn't go to Joseon to make small ships. The prince realized that no matter where he went, engineers always shared the same ambitions. He presented him with a sketch of a boat, with oars, an open deck, and a single sail. A different structure immediately caught the engineer's attention, the windlass. Then the prince said that this boat carried 4 times more cargo than a common fishing boat, much to the engineer's surprise. Using the windlass made the work easier, requiring only a single mast. He praised the prince, saying that although he didn't know how to build ships, he knew how to create new things. A small ship that surpassed a larger one would also be a source of pride for an engineer, and he asked Fang to consider the invitation. And if he considered going with them, he should visit his lodging within the next 10 days. They are now on a farm in the outskirts of Nanjing. The cabbage plants are fabulous, large, and tasty, and it would be easy to stock them for the winter. The prince realized that they were like the ancestors of modern cabbages. Approaching the owner, he gave her a coin to select the best seeds, and she immediately agreed to do so. In a choral, he asked how many years it took for the pig to grow, and his owner said only 1. The largest ones reach 140 kilos, while those in Joseon barely surpass 30. And the prince wanted to know if they could buy 100 of those, but the farmer didn't have that many. However, nothing that a larger sum of money couldn't solve, and soon the breeder had already complied with the prince. As twilight approached, the prince said that their time in the Ming Empire was coming to an end, and the coins borrowed from the eunuchs were already gone. Even though paying them back would be easy, it was complicated dealing with someone whose thoughts were unknown. But for the prosperity of Zhoujin, that had to be done. A servant approached, saying that Fang was there looking for him. He was pleased with the news, as it seemed that talented people were gathering in Zhoujin. He asked if the servants had prepared everything, as they had many books with them. Since there was more baggage than people, the return trip would be difficult. But the winds were good, and it might take only 6 days to reach their destination. One of the servants wanted to know how they would be received with all those gifts, but the prince asked him not to worry. In a palace, someone is looking for his highness. Approaching him, he said that something grand was happening, because a commotion was developing in Muakche. He was almost breaking his deadlift record and said that if it wasn't important, someone would pay the price. Those who had traveled on the diplomatic mission had returned, and that pleased the king. But with their arrival, the pigs escaped, causing great chaos. He said it wasn't such a big deal, as they should only be small pigs. But the servant said the largest ones were over 40 kilos. That was enough for the king to grasp the magnitude of the problem. In the city, the pigs were running loose and people were trying to capture them. The pigs were so strong that they were compared to boars. One of the soldiers asked another to help, but he was afraid of pigs. Holding a pig in his hands, he realized he was being targeted by an enraged sow. He was terrified because the sow was about to unleash her fury on him. She was burning with anger, ready to give that man a beating. It didn't take long for the prince to appear and grab one of the pigs by its tail. It had been a year since he was away, and if this continued, his reputation would be tarnished. After the great commotion, the piglets were finally confined safely. They even seemed surprised that they had managed to escape to freedom. The king was pleased with what he saw, as they were strong animals that resembled boars in their physical build. And as he approached one of them, it became startled. He offered a bit of food, considering that it must have been tired from the journey. With great care and attention, he continued offering food to the pig. In response, the animal became deeply captivated. It began to eat without worry. It seemed that the hunger they felt was truly extraordinary. Given their size and vigor, he was relieved about the future, and the pigs celebrated that this person was kind to them. It didn't take long for him to order the plumpest of the pigs to be prepared for the fire. Since they had lost many books, the prince made sure to replace them, and the king mentioned that his ministers would have a lot of work ahead of them. Since he had worked so hard, he asked the prince if there was anything he desired, and indeed there was, for he had learned much on his journey. He knew that if the new agricultural techniques were employed there in Zhoujin, the diet of everyone would change significantly, possibly reducing malnutrition. It didn't take long for Fang to be introduced to the king, who said that given the journey, he would make sure to designate space for each of them to stay in that distant land, to which they were grateful. The disciples presented themselves to Suming, who acknowledged that they had been working hard. He mentioned that Zhongvu had done an excellent job with those young men. Zhongvu was grateful, but said that being a teacher was more difficult than being a student. The prince understood the social dynamics faced by the children of concubines, but he believed he would know how to handle it. Now he told them that he would teach the young men a new path, and the name of it is CrossFit, because he knew that repetitive movements were boring. So they would do various exercises so that the mind wouldn't get tired, and he asked them to watch him. He demonstrated how to perform a burpee, which he had developed while traveling. The young men were delighted to realize that they wouldn't need to lift weights anymore. Equally enthusiastic, he said they would do 20 and then demonstrated another exercise, jumping over a log 20 times. After that, they would do 20 kettlebell swings, finishing the sequence with 20 bodyweight squats. They would do it twice, rest a bit, and then repeat everything twice more, and one of the young men was pleased that the workout seemed easier. However, the prince said that this was like the silence before a sudden storm, much to the students' dismay. A bird happily flew over their heads. On the ground, the students were desperate from the suffering of that intense training. It didn't take long for one of them to start feeling unwell. He was adamant that he was about to vomit. The prince, who didn't expect that, was surprised. However, he told him to vomit and continue because the same thing had happened to him. People don't die so easily. The disciples were exhausted, with their souls almost leaving their bodies. In front of them, he said that even after 6 months, they still lacked knowledge. It was time for them to open the books and start studying, because when their strength ran out, so would their distractions. One of them said that he wouldn't be able to read in that physical state, but it was necessary. Jumbo and Susan had done it, and now they were both scholars. Silence filled the study room. The younger prince asked if that was a copy of the famous calligrapher Chu Suliang. But among all those books, that wasn't the only interesting one. There were copies of various works rich in knowledge, to the delight of those who enjoyed studying. Seeing the enthusiasm, the older one said that on the next trip, it would be interesting for his brother to accompany him as well. His brother was pleased with that because he wanted to visit the province where the descendants of Confucius lived. Moreover, their father, who was already pleased with the outcome of that expedition, had already suggested that he accompany his brother on the next one. Seeing his brother surprised, he asked if there was a problem. He asked if he had seen the sculpted physique of the assistant scribe, and since the journey was difficult, his brother's frail body concerned him, because physical strength is necessary for long-distance travel. He tried to excuse himself, saying that his delicate body was a hindrance to carrying so much weight. But that wasn't a problem, and even while lifting weights, the older one's calligraphy remained identical, much to the younger one's dismay. Then he said that his brother had never been interested in developing calligraphy. He quickly asked him to stop making excuses, because he would personally train him to strengthen the bond between them. In front of them was the newest firearm developed by one of them. Holding it, he aimed at a target in front of him. The shot was fired with the new weapon. Its force pierced through armor at close range and even leather at a distance. The firepower was enormous. He asked what it would take to improve it, and as they conversed, someone watched them from hiding. Someone had sent a spy to the land of Joseon. The Prince of Joseon has various skills in creating items, such as soaps, and extending silver coins. He's said to be informed if he develops an item that doesn't yet exist in the market. The eunuch knows that at the moment nothing is more valuable than silver coins, which he has in abundance. To pierce leather, the distance must not exceed 180 meters, and it should initially be handled over the shoulder, or below the chin, but the weapon's recoil was too powerful for this grip. That's why he developed this stance where the shot is made while holding the weapon at waist level. The prince recognizes that he is facing a revolutionary item, and that weapon could be crucial for besieging a city or defending it. However, his brother didn't understand the proposal since he developed it to be carried by the infantry. Yet, it couldn't be aimed in an attack situation, and he was going to demonstrate this himself. The birds take flight from the clearing. To his astonishment, the shot pierced through wood and an armor plate. The bullets missed the targets, so adjustments are needed to increase shooting accuracy, and the aiming method is not very convenient. Indeed, weaker soldiers could get injured by a shot, and he intends to reduce the size of the weapon. He promptly asked his brother if he had any suggestions for solving this problem. After thinking carefully about it, he believes he has a solution. However, they noticed that someone was nearby. He thought it might have just been him, but he heard a sound in the vicinity. The prince goes to another place and asks if Pak Gang is there, receiving confirmation that he is. That man had experience in constructing crossbows, and the prince wanted to know if he could build the structure. Not only could he do that, but he was also already improving the design and would soon show it to him. He said he would shoot himself to demonstrate the problem they had at hand. He positioned the crossbow at eye level, preparing to aim. Soon he fired the first shot. Even so, he hit the target squarely. His brother immediately noticed what he wanted to demonstrate. For good accuracy, the alignment of the eyes and the weapon must be on the same line. Another difficulty would be holding the flame with one hand and the weapon with the other. This distraction could make it easier for enemy troops to approach. Thus, combining the crossbow's structure with the firepower of the new weapon would be the solution. He then asked Pak Gang to stop whatever he was doing to make the first prototype of what they had just imagined. Bent over a table, they began to think about the operational problems of the new weapon, avoiding practical issues. Since that day, 3 months of hard work have passed. The king knows that the day of the new weapon's presentation has arrived. They prepared very well, and they even gathered the army officers to be present. Although they are talented, firearms have proven to be of little reliability. The prince ordered them to prepare to fire the weapons. They filled the barrels of the guns with gunpowder. They tamped it down into the base of the gun barrel. Soon after that, the projectile was placed in the barrel. The officers watched with a certain disbelief, and they said what they lacked was battlefield experience because it was too noisy. Once the weapon was prepared, the prince ordered the shots to be fired. The soldier pulled the trigger of his musket. A loud and audible shot echoed from the gun's barrel. Some of the officers present smiled at the scene before them. Then someone was ordered to check the target to confirm the accuracy. Not only had it made contact, but the shot had also hit the center of the target. They did not expect such a noisy item to be capable of such accuracy. One of them asked what it was that they were seeing. The older officer realized that only one shot was fired at a time. With the enemy far away, several shots would be needed. The next weapon was to be used, and the responsible soldier was already in position. The officers noticed that it was a robust weapon, and its operator would need to be well capable. He fired towards the target, and 2 of the shots hit the center of the test target. That weapon proved useful, however, it was hindered by the lengthy reload time. One of them thought it would be useful for shoot and run tactics, but even so, that's not a good strategy. The king observed the demonstration in silence. Afterward, he called the prince to him. The first one isn't powerful, and the second is too slow. He wanted to know how those weapons could be useful on the battlefield. He mentioned that the hand cannon wouldn't replace the bow and that it takes 10 years for an archer to develop their skills. However, those who were in the demonstration needed only 15 days to learn, to the king's surprise. Compared to the bow that was extremely fast, in the same time, one barely learns how to hold a bow. He had only demonstrated the performance of soldiers with 15 days of practice. There was still something else to be demonstrated to them. Then a platoon trained in this new combat strategy was presented. He ordered the soldiers to prepare to fire their shots. As soon as they assumed their stance, he ordered them to fire. A barrage of shots hit the targets. 19 of the 60 shots fired hit the center of the targets. The accuracy was good for the distance, and the reload time had significantly decreased. The king was surprised, as that level of performance is not achieved quickly. The prince mentioned that a soldier with 2 months of practice is on par with an archer who took years to perfect his skills. Now he wanted to demonstrate what the 2-inch cannon was capable of. The cannon was positioned on the field. It was massive, surprising the officers present. They wanted to know what kind of ammunition it used, and they would soon see the cannon's firepower. The loud shot was fired in front of them. The target was hit and quickly engulfed in the flames of the explosion. There wasn't an officer present who wasn't surprised by that. The king was now convinced that their enemies were powerless against that military might. The prince was flattered by the praise he received. He mentioned that you also helped him a lot with that. Incense burns in Zhen's residence in the Ming Empire. The eunuch realizes that they are developing weapons, and his servant suggests that the spy sends copies of the plans. But he knows that if drawn by someone unfamiliar with the project, it won't be useful. The ideal situation would be to get their hands on an actual example. The king speaks with one of his sons about the weapons presented earlier. There is a problem with mass-producing those weapons. They have just received a message from the Ming Empire. They have learned about what they are developing, and the emperor has requested the weapons as a tribute since he is interested in them. And he is certainly referring to the new weapons, much to the prince's surprise. He doesn't know how they found out about it, and since the letter is generic, it might not be about the weapons. That's possible, but the king has another concern. If they send something else, it could create a conflict between the two parties. Thinking about the situation, the prince knows that Zhen is behind this. If that's the case, he asked his father to send 2,000 units as a tribute. That was a lot, and he thought of sending 500 units a year. However, his son was adamant in his advice. Inside the secret palace of Ming, something was happening. Zhen was pleased with the 2,000 units that would be given to them, and the third prince would deliver 500 units himself. There's no way a small province could oppose Ming. The curious one wanted to know why he wrote objects in the letter. The eunuch said that if they receive something else, it's because Zhou has another plan. In that case, they could pressure them to receive more tributes. But since the king is a smart man, that wouldn't be the case, and he would be ready to use the situation to ask them for something even more valuable. They could ask for the second prince as a hostage if they were opposed, including the use of military force if they resisted. In the quiet village, life goes on as usual. Someone is chopping wood outside. The young man asked Xiaoling if he had read the proclamation, but he couldn't read it. It said that the government was recruiting a new unit, the military training command. That seems strange, and if things went wrong, they would be sent to the north. Since the recruitment will be in the capital, the training must be there too, and it seems that Prince Siang was the one who came up with the idea. The woodcutter thinks they are looking for a cavalry unit, but he doesn't have a horse and immediately dismisses that possibility. However, the proclamation didn't mention anything about horses, not even about bows. This made the woodcutter ponder the possibilities, and he promptly asked if the young man was telling the truth about that. What they want is just the identification of names, strong and willing people. They don't even care about the past. Snow falls in another place, and someone wants to know if those who undergo the training will become commoners. The man tells the messenger that if he flees, his family will be punished in his place. Prostrated, he thanks his lord for the opportunity. He will pray for the safety of his family, regardless of social status, as many young men from the 8 provinces were going. Believing they could become army officers, the young men began to gather at the designated place. So far, there were just over 1,000 volunteers. It was a lower number than the prince had expected, and it would indeed be difficult. These people didn't even know the purpose of that division. Considering the benefits of belonging to the army, the turnout was far below expectations. The prince became frustrated as the man continued to hide behind him. He wanted the prince to speak on his behalf, but that man was the minister of war who commanded the army. He had only done administrative tasks until that day, but the prince reassured him, saying the king hadn't appointed him for nothing. Taking the lead, the prince addressed the recruits present. He congratulated them for having endured the winter to get there. He said he would be in command of that division under the orders of the king. Since they would be training with new weapons, not all of them would get to use them. Only those who passed the test would be eligible, but the first test would be easy. It consisted of a race. Since they had arrived there on foot, they should be capable of it, as a soldier's life depends on his ability to move. Without a conditioned lower body, they couldn't be called men. Now they were to run from there to the training center behind them. Their destination was Tianjin, so they should prepare quickly. The march began, and they were to imagine that the enemy was pursuing them. They started running, and he ordered the tired ones to make way for those with better pace. The test was exhausting, and only 403 managed to pass it. Now he would teach them a training technique he had developed because they must have heard about the path of conditioning one's body. During a second test, they would examine each one's self-discipline in conditioning their bodies. They were to perform an inclined bench press with 80% of their body weight, squats with a weight equivalent to theirs, and deadlift with a load slightly heavier than their body weight. He decided to start with one who was standing in front, who responded positively. The man placed his hands on the barbell. It didn't matter if he fell. He was to give his all in that execution. He exerted considerable effort to perform the exercise, but even so, he ended up falling. The advantage was that the prince had his disciples to help, preventing serious injuries to the recruits. After this test, only 221 were fit to continue the training, so they moved to the final training location. The platoon advanced through the cold night, guided by torches. One of them still felt his legs trembling, and another was worried that the cold might cause them to perish. One of the candidates asked what Hong thought of the tests. He was categorical in saying that the tests were too easy. Even if the weight were increased, he wouldn't have difficulty, and the next test should also be easy. Finally, they arrived at their destination, at the fortress of Mahanzan. The prince said that this was the place where they would be forged into true soldiers. He ordered them to bathe with soap and prepare to eat, and one of the recruits wanted to know if they could use soaps since it was valuable. The prince said that as soldiers, they could use soap every day. Great was the joy that filled the platoon upon hearing that. The next day, he would personally interview them, so they were to clean up and rest. It would take them 7 months to complete the training and graduate as junior officers, and the day dawned at the fortress. The recruits were already being interviewed. The session was almost over with only a few people left. In front of the prince was one who had once been a slave. He wanted to know the reason for the enlistment, and the young man learned from his master that this would elevate his parents' social status as well. He was small and thin, below average. Since childhood, he felt it was his responsibility to lift his parents out of that life, so he worked hard. The prince was eager to see the progress of someone like him, full of determination, so he told him he could leave, to which the young man thanked him. Then he looked at the file of the next one to be interviewed. Seeing it, he was immediately surprised. It was the butcher Yun Xiong. He introduced himself, saying he was well-conditioned, but didn't know how to ride a horse since his family never owned one. He enlisted because he intended to be successful in life. The prince wondered if he would be able to change that young man who had heard that he could become the leader of the infantry. The prince said that a leader needs to understand his subordinates and not use cruelty to be heard. He wanted to know if Yun Xiong could do that. The young man said that if he couldn't be tough on his subordinates, he wondered why soldiers existed at all. Upon hearing that, the prince became briefly pensive. He told the young man that he hoped he would have an answer by the end of their training. And with those words, he dismissed him from the interview. The young man left the room with his release, but the prince held the expectation that the young man would change, for even the king had changed. In the field, the platoon was already practicing their march. Someone ordered them to cease their side conversations. It was an interesting way to train them, and someone asked Hong for his opinion on it. It was an adaptation for the platoon, so that on the battlefield they could follow orders with cohesion, because it was there that living people turned into lifeless pieces of flesh. On aboard, the prince was teaching them the command signals. Those who would lead soldiers needed to learn these commands. They were sitting, perfecting their knowledge. One of the supervisors noticed something. He asked if the recruit knew how to use the command after reading it. He replied that he was still learning, but was doing so without rushing. The prince considered dismissing him if he remained too energetic, but it seemed he followed orders obediently. If he continued this way, he would be the first leader of that new division. A young man complained about losing the game once again. Seeing his colleague leave, he said it was his turn to play. He replied that he had never played that game before and that he was going to take a walk. The other told him he shouldn't do that, as rest was important too. He left the tent to walk under the twilight. Memories of his home flooded his mind. His father had given him the only valuable thing he had to sell and fund his journey. He told him never to return and not to worry about them. The harshness of that memory wouldn't leave his mind. Something in front of him caught his attention. It was the only tent with lighting on the outside. He entered it to see what was inside. He encountered a man practicing some kind of training. The man told the young man that if he was there out of curiosity, he should leave, and the young man apologized. He looked around and saw that the man used similar objects for training, but the ones he saw were exceptionally larger. He asked what the purpose of that large club was, to which the man replied with a sadistic smile. He asked the young man to hold it, and he would demonstrate its purpose. He explained that the instrument had a very specific purpose. It was used to increase grip strength and dexterity for handling close combat weapons, moving it slowly. The young man couldn't imagine how anyone could move it slowly, as it was so heavy. He tried it himself, but soon succumbed to the weight. Exhausted, he wanted to meet the person who had created such a challenging method. The man told him that it was Prince Surain who had invented it. The exercises were specific to the weapons they would handle. Since the young man didn't know what he would do yet, he should try them all. He wanted to try with the shield, thinking that he wouldn't have to use that. But the supervisor approached with a large shield weighing 24 kilos, to the young man's dismay. He apologized, saying he couldn't imagine being able to operate it for training. He thought about leaving the tent immediately. However, the supervisor asked where he was going. Once he was there, he should continue practicing with other things. The young man was already deeply regretting his curiosity. An hour passed in training and he was dismissed, expecting to be seen there the next day. He was completely exhausted and didn't know how he would endure the training. He looked ahead and saw something. In front of him was another recruit as well. It was Yang Hen, who asked where he had been since recruits were forbidden to leave the camp. He said he was tired of training with weaklings and decided to go out to exercise. The young man was startled when he looked at Yang's arm. It was stained with blood and he assumed he had been injured during training. The sadistic man said nothing for a moment. Then he told the young man that he was the only one who had seen him and that he knew he had sneaked out of the camp. He asked him to forget what he had seen because he had the impression that the prince was watching him. He told him to go back inside and not to worry because the blood wasn't his. The day dawned at the king's palace. Before them, the youngest son wanted to show his progress with physical exercises. He asked them to watch because he wouldn't have come this far without his parents' support. His parents were genuinely enthusiastic about it. He gripped the barbell with strength. He lifted it off the rack with ease. He managed to move a weight of nearly 90 kilograms, much to the pride of his father, who remarked that no one could say anymore that his son only licks pens. Now he wanted to demonstrate his skill in the deadlift. The barbell loaded with weight began to rise from the ground. He completed the movement, showing no sign of strain on his face. The barbell was placed on another rack. Indeed, the way he lifted was impressive, considering he hadn't trained extensively. Even though he had only been practicing for a short time, the progress was remarkable, and he thanked his brothers for their support, as he could now travel with a healthy body. However, the king told him not to be content with that. There was still a long way to go, and he shouldn't stop. The middle brother noticed that even after training, their father was not easily impressed. He also wanted to see Yu's progress in physical conditioning. He had heard that Yu had made progress, but in reality, he had been dedicating his time to training the recruits, so he was only training 6 times a week. With his physique on display, he revealed a body sculpted by physical exercises. His parents were always impressed by his size and definition. He said he was always training and would perform a squat with a modest 260 kilograms. The bar descended as if it were made of paper. Yu exerted force like a wild animal, and he rose as if it were much lighter than it actually was. After demonstrating his strength, he realized that at the beginning, his ambitions were bold, but his body had transformed. Normally, he wouldn't lift that much weight. It was truly fascinating. The king said that he could rest, but he thought that weight was intimidating and was even worried about his son. Yu said he didn't need rest, much to his father's surprise, and now he would perform the deadlift. He gripped the bar with strength, and his vascularity was enormous. Even his brothers were surprised by what they were about to see. The same could be seen on the faces of the soldiers present. The bar was lifted from the ground as if it were a small paperweight. The king was utterly impressed that his son was capable of lifting all that. He wanted his son's body to be drawn on a panel before he departed on his journey, and that panel would be placed in the training hall as inspiration for everyone. Now he imagined that the academy would be filled with drawings of bodies from that point forward. Yu was embarrassed, but his father said these feats should be remembered in history because they were impressive. And the sum of that weight across the 3 exercises would be named after him. In the training field, they were going to divide the recruits so they could adapt to specific weapons. The shooters would be the ones tasked with handling the new provincial weapon, and it was time for them to choose what they would specialize in. The platoon responded in unison to the order. A servant approached to report the numbers achieved with that division: 41 shield bearers, 51 spearmen, 63 swordsmen, and 66 shooters, which was fewer than expected for the latter, but that was due to the novelty of the weapon. Additionally, he had to develop appropriate training for them, which worried him a bit. One of them asked if those huge plates were what the shield bearers would use, and someone confirmed. They were so massive that not even the strength of a tiger could dent them. A superior ordered them to stop dawdling, grab their equipment, and get into position. Their first training was to learn to move the shield in all directions, but the weight was too intimidating for the recruits. He ordered them to stop talking and start exercising. Even though it was heavy, they had no other choice, as the shield was large to be more effective in defense and prevent enemy advancement. They didn't know how the cannons given to Ming as tribute would be used, so they needed to be prepared. Only the strongest would be able to become shield bearers. To avoid being pierced by projectiles, they needed to be very solid. Recruits commented that one of them had become very strong, and they wanted to know what he had been doing to achieve that. One of them said that San could probably stop now. He had likely lost count of his executions. This dialogue caught the prince's attention. That guy looked very different and visibly stronger. In front of them was a different weapon, a sword similar to a scythe, a brow blade which can exceed 2 meters in length. This deadly object weighs about 9 kilograms. The young man wields it skillfully, as it has been a week since the specific training began. With the increase in difficulty, some of them began to quit, but those who remained persevered in their training. However, a month and a half was enough to change the recruits, who were now conditioned and determined. Some of them were eating under the shade of a tree. One remarked that although the training was tough, the food was good. They ate so much that it seemed they would get sick, but they didn't, and they had to eat with their shields on their backs. The young man mentioned that he had hardly eaten pork before, but he had started eating it here and had loved it ever since. Eating pork instead of the usual meat was a luxury for them. As soon as he finished eating, he stood up to get another portion of food. That young man had developed greatly with the routine of training and proper nutrition. Finally, the recruits were beginning to look like real soldiers, and the prince remarked that the lower body was the most important. They would receive new socks and shoes because they would be going on a march in 2 days. A recruit asked how this march would be. To their dismay, they were told they would be covering 40 kilometers on foot. That night, rain began to fall in the region. Underneath it were the recruits with protection and hats. Carrying their equipment, one of them said that if it were up to him, he would run away, but his companion replied that he would end up as a tiger's dinner. The prince ordered them to halt the march for a short rest. One of them had already run out of provisions, and his colleague offered to share some. The prince ordered everyone to eat a little salt when they drank water, and those without water were told not to worry, as they would receive more once they reached the next station. They mentioned among themselves how good it was to be under the command of someone like the prince. After resting, he ordered them to resume their positions and continue the march. There was only 1 month left to complete the training. The prince looked to the side. There was someone who had been observing. Since the beginning, Seong had proven to be exceptional, and Hong San, who had arrived weak, was now a completely different person. Not just them, but everyone there had changed significantly. These results genuinely made the prince happy with his achievement, and he couldn't wait to show that division to his father. In the palace of the Ming province, the emperor was present. He was receiving the third prince of Joseon, Yaoyang. He had heard about him and knew that the young man had an interest in calligraphy. He wanted him to write a phrase for him. Demonstrating his skill, the emperor was satisfied with what he saw. Now he wanted to know more about the tributes that had been brought. Although they were hand cannons, he wanted to know why they hadn't been used in combat, and the prince explained that they couldn't be used recklessly, as they were civilized and had a responsibility to others who needed that clarification. The emperor wanted to know if he had sent equipment that hadn't yet been tested in battle. The prince explained that the firepower pierced armor and that with a month and a half of training, a soldier could already use it proficiently. Seeing the young man's confidence, the emperor wanted to witness the firepower of the weapon with his own eyes. On the sunny day that greeted them, a soldier was in position to use the hand cannon. His shots struck the armor and 3 of the 8 hit the target. With those penetrations, anyone inside the armor would have perished without a doubt. It used less gunpowder and fired more quickly. It was better than the cannons they had. The emperor smiled, pleased, as he hadn't expected another prince of Joseon to be so talented as well. He wanted to know if they could supply 1,000 units every year, but the young man explained that they needed to reinforce their defenses, and that number was too large. They had come willing to provide 2,000 units and hoped that their honesty would be rewarded. Back at the military camp, the recruits were brawling. The prince had just knocked one down with a well-placed punch. The standing recruit was apprehensive. The other gathered himself, knowing the blow had been strong. Meanwhile, the prince was visibly upset with what had happened. Strang's behavior had removed him from his position. The day was beautiful at the Longman Grotto's park, and Gaiam was admiring the various Buddha statues in the area. He pointed out a newly made statue there for Prince Ampyeong to see. It was of a very strong man, and they wondered what it represented, perhaps another aspect of Buddha. As they progressed, there were more statues similar to that one. What was intriguing was the face of the statues, which was identical to Prince Semang. Seeing a sculptor nearby, they asked who was responsible for making those statues. Years ago, swindlers were selling a deceptive product to people, and a deity descended from the heavens to punish them personally. Since that event, the appearance of Buddha has been depicted a bit differently. The painter smiled as he realized it was indeed Siang, who would be happy to know this. However, the prince was outraged as his brother's muscles were far more defined than those depicted in the statues. The painter asked His Highness to restrain himself as it could spark rumors among the people, but he couldn't contain himself in the face of such a flabby musculature. The painter imagined that their return would be delayed, and the prince said he would take action. And there they found a suitable place compatible with both the intelligence and the physique of his brother. Months passed, and the statue was finally carved into the stone. Unlike the others, it was as if a dragon were ascending to the heavens, and thus the Ming Empire gained a statue of a trembleized Buddha. In the training field, a superior asked the troops to pay attention. They were to salute the king, who was there to see them. In unison and organized, they gave their salute. Seeing the organization of the troops, the king praised them, for they had achieved this through hard work, and they would be an example for all officers after them. In response, they vowed to fight for the king until their last breath. Looking at his son, the king said it was time to check how proficient they were in the art of war. He ordered the troops to get into formation immediately. Soon, they were all taking their battle positions. Then they grouped into teams of 4 soldiers in a line. One of them untied logs that were positioned on the hilltop. Below, the shield bearers prepared to stop the advance of what would be enemies. The well-positioned shields managed to stop the logs. One of them ordered the others to push and then advance immediately after. With precise strikes from their axes, the wood was cut. Demonstrations were also made with the spearmen. It didn't take long for the swordsman's turn to come. One of them was focused and ready for the demonstration. He advanced quickly towards the target, and with precise strikes, he sliced the training dummy into several pieces. Afterward, the shooters took their positions and fired their cannons. Among them was also a weapon capable of firing multiple arrows at once. That weapon had been made specifically for them, an improvement on something that already existed. It was immediately fired at the target. Once it hit, it was engulfed in the flames of the explosion. The king applauded what he saw, given that the performance had been splendid. With all that military might, no enemy could prosper against them. The display of power from that new unit was overwhelming. By the king's order, people of lower social classes were now elevated, and Hong Sam received a new name, Jung Biamsu. Someone reading a document was confirming if the soldiers had indeed done all that. His servant said that the king had personally confirmed all these feats. If all this were true, that division was much better prepared than an ordinary soldier. But there was a significant caveat. They were all novices without battle experience, and some of them might not withstand the pressure of combat. They hadn't trained in winter and couldn't imagine what it was like to camp in the snow. And this unit must have been created to be at the front of the battle in the war to come. He wanted to gain his own experience as well, but his servants said that with the arrival of winter, things would be dangerous. They could send 30 people. Once trained, what they needed now was real experience. He would send a veteran soldier with them, so they wouldn't perish in the cold. If a soldier perished, they couldn't face the king. And that was the entire purpose of the military training command. They couldn't trust the protection of the northern border to these soldiers, said Yi Qinggok, a general of the Joseon dynasty. The general presented himself to the troops. They saluted him in a rather unconventional manner, using the modern methodology. He welcomed them to the far northern region, acknowledging that they were well trained. He informed them that the area was dangerous and full of bandits, and the soldiers spoke of their wounds and challenges they had overcome. He wanted to know if they were capable of overcoming those difficulties and if they would be able to handle the extreme cold. For now, they would have their first mission. They were to climb to the top of Bakdalwang Mountain and leave their mark there. They were to select 30 men and set off on the journey, and he would assign them 2 guides. The time limit for completing this mission was only 8 days. They were to prove the capabilities of the military training command, and the guide introduced himself to them. Now that they were there, they had to plan their advance, and they would be in trouble if anything went wrong in the planning. Soldiers must follow orders even if there are bandits in the vicinity. That place was different from the cold they had experienced during training. Even experienced people lose fingers there due to the excessive cold. One soldier became irritated by the comment. He said the guide could join them if he wanted, but if he was going to complain, it would be better not to accompany them. Byumsu mentioned that one of the instructors was from that region and had taught them a lot about climbing, so the guide would be very useful. But the other soldier became even more irritated by the comment. He said they had no time to waste and those who were ready should prepare to march. Some commented that even though they were prepared, more than half of them would likely lose some fingers and might not even know how to fight. Additionally, they were curious about the metal bar they were carrying on their backs. The guide thought they were carrying too much weight with the weapons and shields, but Byumsu told him not to worry about them. And the chains they wore on their shoes didn't provide as much traction on the ice. He wanted to know who suggested they wear them. Byumsu remembered the tension between the prince and his colleague. The prince had struck him in the face without hesitation. It was he who ordered them to use the chains, and Byumsu asked the guide to stop asking questions. After marching all day, they set up camp as night fell. The tents began to be pitched. By the campfire, the guide wanted to know how the soldiers were so well prepared for the cold, and it was all thanks to the prince. They had undergone some training sessions in the mountains. Dinner was ready, and the guide said it smelled very delicious. Byumsu mentioned that it was the camp's ration. It wasn't very tasty, but it provided plenty of energy for marching. The guide tasted the stew he was given. He found it very good and wanted to know how it was made, and the unique flavor was due to the smoked meat and the apples he had added. A soldier approached, saying that the tents had been fully set up. Now they would take turns guarding the camp with 6 guards at a time. Byumsu ordered them to divide into pairs, stay at the perimeter's edge, and carry whistles with them. It didn't take long for the soldiers to start sleeping in their tents. One of them remained by the fire. Another asked if everything was okay with the fire, but his colleague replied that it wasn't his turn to watch yet. Indeed, it wasn't, but he wanted to talk to his colleague and suggested he be more gentle when speaking to others. In response, he said that even though they were comrades, he was the leader and people tended to take advantage of opportunities. And if he was unhappy that they held the same rank, he should speak to him about it. But that wasn't what Byumsu was thinking. However, his colleague accused him of telling the prince about his nighttime escapades. He tried to justify himself, but his colleague told him to stop talking. It was time to change the guard teams, and he advised his friend to be careful, because next time it might be him who betrays him. As the days passed, the platoon managed to reach the mountain's summit. Some couldn't believe it, and even the guide said it was the first time he had climbed the mountain with such comfort. Standing there before the flag, someone asked if there was a problem. Dark clouds were forming in the sky to the northwest of the region. Not far away, a hungry tiger was watching them. The leader ordered them to descend quickly and make torches, even if they had to destroy the tents, as it was dangerous to be isolated in the mountains like that. Behind Yang a tiger leaped, and his colleagues barely managed to warn him. Time seemed to freeze due to the stress of the situation as he tried to turn to face the danger approaching. Yang's sword began to be drawn. The officer managed to strike the beast, cutting it and repelling its attack, but he felt that the cut wasn't deep enough to discourage the tiger from attacking again. It didn't take long for Byumsu to advance with his shield in hand. The tiger was enormous, and a single paw could almost cover the entire shield. The force of the attack caused Byumsu to lose his balance. His comrades were desperate, imagining the worst would happen. Both of them fell off the cliff. Meanwhile, the prince was leading an exercise routine, and they were about to do a sequence of repetitions. The recruits were exhausted from the intensity of the training. He kept pushing them, not allowing them to give up on completing the exercises. They continued doing sit-ups, counting along with the prince. Byumsu struggled to keep up as the count would only proceed with perfect execution. His legs were failing and he could barely keep them in the air. All the while, the prince's watchful eyes were supervising them. The recruits screamed in pain as their bodies were nearing collapse. When the exercises finally ended, a dense silence filled the place. The soldiers felt as if their bodies were in constant pain. But the count hadn't ended, and the prince wanted to know why they had stopped and what number they were on. Despair filled the recruits as the training wasn't over. He asked again, "Where is the count?" They responded that they were at 62. Byansoo had these memories, but now he was far from his battalion, lying in the snow. He was alive and his companion was beside him, but unconscious. He tried to wake Yang, who slowly began to stir. It didn't take long for him to finally wake up. Once awake, Yang asked where they were. They were in the middle of the cliff and had survived thanks to the snow and the trees. He wanted to know if his friend could move. Byansoo said yes, that he felt fine and hoped they hadn't been out for too long. Once they were both awake, it was time to make their way out of there as quickly as possible. But Yang had noticed something about his companion. Byansoo was injured and blood was oozing from his wound. The snow fell from the sky without giving any respite. The two continued to march, and Byansoo used a branch to help him move forward. However, his strength was slowly fading. He told his friend to continue and meet the 8-day deadline. He would rest for a while. Yang looked at him incredulously. Looking at the nearby snow, he could tell that the tiger was still in the vicinity, and yet Byansoo wanted to stay alone. Byansoo insisted that he was fine and that his companion should continue the journey. In his thoughts, Byansoo imagined that in his current state, he would only be a burden, nothing more. So Yami continued his path as suggested by his colleague. Byansoo remained in the snow now alone. He still believed he had made the right decision. The tracks were fresh and waiting had been the right thing to do. What he hadn't expected, however, was that the tiger would find him so soon. The beast, which hadn't eaten for days, would go after Yangdae as soon as it finished with Byansoo. There was no turning back, and a massive body like that might not even feel the shot. But one of his eyes was injured. Perhaps that would help him defeat the beast. He awaited the tiger's approach, knowing a precise shot was his only chance of survival. The shot was fired and passed over the top of the tiger's head. The tiger leaped towards him. With its jaws open, it prepared to deliver a singular deadly strike. Byansoo's eyes reflected the image of the creature ready to consume his life. From the start, dealing with it alone was impossible, and blood sprayed across the snow. The tiger roared in pain, for it had been pierced by a blade, Yang's sword. Looking at his companion, Yang said, "Don't get the wrong idea, I didn't come back because of you. Anyone who didn't return would put the unit's reputation at risk." Byansoo smiled at hearing that justification. He asked Yang if he was still angry with the prince. He remembered the conversation they had when Yang had abandoned the camp. While they were talking, there was another who witnessed that interaction. The supervisor noticed that one of them was stained with blood. He said they should expel Xiong because he had left the camp and posed as an officer in the city, looking for fights with troublemakers. And that behavior would tarnish their reputation. They weren't expelled, but even so, the prince had punched him. His expression in response was far from friendly. A supervisor asked if the prince had to do that because the action had shocked the entire camp. The prince had done that to quell the murmurs about Xiong, and perhaps it would serve as an opportunity for him to gain some perspective. The supervisor thought it would have been better to give only a verbal reprimand, but Xiong was proud, and that might have had the opposite effect. It's difficult to change someone's personality in 7 months, but with training, he could be refined. Xiong then asked why they were having this conversation, saying he didn't remember much about it and had long since let go of that grudge. Meanwhile, Byansoo looked at him with understanding. The battalion continued searching for the two who had gotten lost. It didn't take long for the guide to spot something on the horizon. It was the 2 officers, and beside them, the carcass of the tiger. Inside the fort, someone gave the order for the soldiers to prepare, as it would be a problem if the storm caught up with the soldiers. They hurried in the barracks to get ready for the rescue. Judging by the weather, the snow must already be waist-deep, and even if they advanced now, it might be too late. But the general knew that doing nothing would be a wasted sacrifice under his responsibility, and he couldn't just stay there and do nothing. He mounted his horse after that. He asked the fastest riders to prepare, as they needed to return with 30 men alive. As soon as the fort's gates were opened, he was met with an unexpected sight. In front of him was the platoon already returned. Seeing the general at the gate, they saluted him according to military doctrine. The general couldn't believe what he was seeing. The junior officer said they had left flags along the way as instructed. Additionally, they had a small surprise. They encountered a mountain tiger and had no choice but to take it down. This delayed their return a bit, for which he apologized for the inconvenience. The general remarked that even with 30 people, dealing with a single tiger was no easy feat. But one of the soldiers said that only 2 officers were responsible for that. Xiong added that it was only possible because Byansoo had pushed the beast back with his shield, though he was left in a precarious condition afterward. A soldier who overheard the story found it hard to believe. The general was deeply impressed that these novices had accomplished all this, and because of that, they were promoted in record time. Inside the barracks, soldiers mocked Xiong, not believing their story. They accused them of being good liars, saying that the 2 of them couldn't possibly have handled a tiger. Losing his patience, Han San said that he was trained with a shield at the military training command, and that it was great everyone was still alive that morning. One of the jokers there immediately turned pale with fear. Now he was going to start the training, but said it wouldn't be difficult. Yet some insisted that he was lying and had killed a starving tiger. After much provocation, Beyonce's patience reached its limit. He removed his garments, revealing a body conditioned to the extreme, much to the surprise of the mockers. He showed the scar he had received from fighting the beast. If it had been deeper, his viscera would have spilled out. The extent of the wound left the loudmouths speechless. He began to brag, saying that as payment, he claimed one of the tiger's eyes, and that on the way back he had chewed that very eye as a snack. He added that it was truly a delicacy. A pity they would never know what it was like. The Joker shivered just hearing the story. After finishing the conversation, he ordered them to grab their bittens, and they feared they were about to be beaten by him. He took a deep breath before responding, as he wanted to know if they were curious. Outside, he said he was going to show them how weak they were and asked them to attack him. He said that if he fell or dropped the shield, he would give each of them a large sum of money, a tempting offer for the other soldiers. One of them prepared to attack, thinking he had nothing to lose. He got ready to strike the officer. Unfortunately for him, he wasn't completely decimated only because it was a friendly sparring match. Sometime later, they were sprawled on the ground after taking a severe beating. The soldiers apologized for their earlier mistake, and Hong asked if they were now ready to train under his supervision. They didn't expect the training to start immediately, but Hong didn't wait for a response and began putting them through the exercises. It was time for them to do some sit-ups. The valley echoed with the screams of pain from the soldiers who struggled to complete the exercise. Meanwhile, things were happening in the capital of Hanyang. The prince who had traveled to Ming had finally returned. Thanks to the visit and the delivery of the hand cannons, they managed to reduce the annual tribute in horses. At home, he encountered one of his brothers. Suang complimented his brother on his physical condition, noting that he looked better, and asked how the trip had been. The prince replied that it was great and that he had managed to speak with some descendants of Confucius about physical conditioning, much to his brother's surprise. He also mentioned that he had brought a gift for his brother from the trip. When he opened it, Suang saw that it was a drawing in the grottos. It was a sculpture based on him, and the prince suggested that when Suang visited Ming, he should see it. The prince mentioned that the sculptures made of him there didn't reflect reality, which angered him, so he had a more realistic one made. Suang sighed as he listened to his younger brother's story. He hugged his brother, pleased and proud of him. At the palace, someone informed them of the arrival of a visitor. Suang wondered who could have arrived at that moment. It didn't take long for him to attend to the matter. The king had gone to the hot springs with one of his sons, the heir, so Suang wasn't sure why the king's grandson was at the palace. The young boy wanted to know more about his uncle's trip to Ming. He asked if the ships crossed the mountains, but his uncle explained that they follow the river's course. The boy was full of curiosity and wanted to know how that was possible. Suang began telling the story of the canal's construction, explaining how the emperor exploited his subjects with cruelty, to the point that people would intentionally injure themselves to avoid forced labor. A servant approached. He said it was time for the boy to study, and he needed to get ready. The boy looked at the teacher who had appeared, and then back at his uncle. The boy clearly didn't want to study now. Since it was a study session, he asked if his uncle could teach him that day. Suang agreed as long as the session didn't exceed an hour. He asked the boy to wait while he went to get something. The boy held back tears, fearing his uncle would return. But Suang came back with a racket in hand and introduced him to the sport of badminton. He explained that to perfect the mind, physical exercise was essential, and intense activities weren't suitable for children who were still developing. That's why he created this sport, which was also a form of learning. With monstrous strength, Suang hit the shuttlecock with the racket. It flew so fast past the boy that he didn't even notice it. The shuttlecock had pierced the wall with the force of the hit. The boy thought he could never achieve that, and Suang realized he had hit it too hard. After practicing with another adult, he had been using too much force. He apologized for being too rough and suggested they try again, this time with less force. He then hit the shuttlecock more gently. The boy used his racket to return the shot, and now the two were spending time together. The boy was thoroughly entertained by the new game. The teacher observed them from the sidelines. He wondered what kind of teaching this was, replacing study. He knew his brother would want to know if his son had studied, and he knew the teacher wanted concrete results. Suang explained that motor coordination was also a form of learning and that it would help in the future. Even though it was different, it was still education. The teacher could only agree with the explanation. Now Suang asked the boy to try to replicate his movements. Skipping that step would be like learning from books without knowing how to read. Another young boy who was watching was also invited to join in. The shuttlecock soared through the air as they played. The boy was very happy and engaged, and the same could be said for his cousin. Even though it was a friendly game, the crown prince's son wasn't as good as his cousin, much to the teacher's irritation. So he suggested they end the game for the day and go inside to study. Suang insisted that the teacher play with them too, but the teacher resisted. The teacher became frustrated and said the prince was abusing his authority. However, it didn't take long for the teacher to succumb to the fun of badminton. Once they were exhausted, it was time to finish playing and head inside. Suang's wife called him in, noting that it was late and time for them to eat. Yet it wasn't long before she too was drawn into the game of badminton. The sport was becoming increasingly popular. The crown prince learned that his son had been visiting his uncle, and that he was missing his late afternoon lessons, which would normally be enough to warrant scolding. However, before long, he too was caught up in the fun of badminton. The eldest prince remarked that he should be informed whenever his brother came up with a new and interesting exercise. It didn't take long for the sport to spread even further. Even among the common people, it became a craze. Soon, Zhoushan had a new traditional and popular game among its citizens. In Ming, the emperor wanted to know how many hand cannons had been produced. His minister reported that they had received 3,000 from Zhoushan and now had around 8,000. The emperor inquired about the ones they were producing themselves, and the minister noted that although similar, they were heavier and tired the troops more quickly. The emperor then designated these cannons for better prepared soldiers, and that to subdue the northern invaders, they should use this weapon. The eunuch affirmed that he would heed the imperial order and ensure more of them were produced. The minister asked if he had heard correctly, the order to subdue the northern invaders. He confirmed, saying they would seize the opportunity to strike their northern enemies. So the video ends here. If you don't want to miss the next part, activate the notification bell, and see you next time on Tab's channel.